Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote depths of Blackbird State Forest in Delaware, where the ancient cypress trees grow so thick that daylight barely touches the forest floor even at noon. I should have listened to the ranger at the station when he gave us that look, the one that said we were making a mistake. But Jake was insistent about going deep into the unmarked trails, away from the designated camping areas. Real wilderness experience, he called it. The three of us had been planning this trip for months. Me, Jake Torino, and Sarah Chen. We'd all been working 60-hour weeks at the consulting firm, and Jake insisted we needed to disconnect completely for a long weekend. The ranger, a weathered man with sunken eyes named Hollis, had traced his finger along the faded map spread across his desk. "You boys and the young lady want to stay closer to the main trails," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much. "Lots of folks get turned around in the deep woods. Cell service dies about 3 miles in, and GPS—" He'd shrugged. "Well, it gets confused." Jake had laughed it off. "We're not tourists, old man. We know what we're doing." Hollis had fixed him with a stare that made my skin crawl. "Son, I've been working these woods for 37 years. The deep forest. It ain't like other places. Things happen out there that don't happen anywhere else." But Jake was already folding up the map, dismissing the old man's concerns with the arrogance I'd grown to hate about him over the past year. Sarah shot me a worried glance, but neither of us spoke up. We should have. The hike in took us 4 hours, our heavy packs cutting into our shoulders as we followed what Jake insisted was a trail, but looked more like a deer path. The trees grew denser the deeper we went, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead like arthritic fingers. The sound of our footsteps on the soft earth seemed muffled, absorbed by the oppressive silence that hung over everything like a wet blanket. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah whispered as we stopped to rest near a stagnant pond covered in green scum. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the canopy above like black glass. Something about it made my stomach turn. "It's just quiet," Jake said, but I noticed he kept his voice low too. City folk forget what real quiet sounds like. But it wasn't just quiet. It was the absence of sound altogether. No birds, no insects, no wind through the leaves, just our breathing and the wet squelch of our boots in the increasingly muddy ground. We set up camp in a small clearing that felt like a pocket of space carved out of the pressing darkness. Even with our headlamps, the light seemed to die just a few feet beyond our little circle. Jake had insisted on bringing a massive canvas tent that required stakes, but the ground was so soft and marshy that nothing would hold properly. We ended up having to tie guide ropes to nearby trees, and I noticed the bark felt strangely warm to the touch, almost like skin. "Fire's not catching," Sarah said, frustration creeping into her voice. She'd been trying to get our campfire started for 20 minutes, but the wood, which looked dry enough, wouldn't take a flame. Even with fire starter and dry kindling, the wood would char and smoke but never actually burn. "Wood must be wetter than it looks," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. He kept glancing over his shoulder at the tree line, where our flashlight beams couldn't penetrate the darkness between the massive trunks. We eventually gave up on the fire and ate cold sandwiches by the light of our battery-powered lantern. The silence pressed in around us, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Every small noise, the rustle of a wrapper, the zip of a backpack, seemed unnaturally loud. "So, what's the plan for tomorrow?" Sarah asked, clearly trying to fill the oppressive quiet. "Deeper," Jake said, studying his GPS device with a frown. "This thing's acting weird. Shows we're about 2 miles southeast of where we should be." I checked my phone. No signal, which was expected, but more concerning was that the GPS seemed to be spinning randomly, showing us in different locations every few seconds. Maybe the old man was right about the GPS getting confused. Satellites don't just stop working, Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. We turned in early, partly because there wasn't much else to do without a fire, but mostly because the darkness felt so heavy and complete that it seemed to press against our little circle of light like a living thing. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, but sleep wouldn't come. The silence was too perfect, too absolute. In all my years of camping, I'd never experienced anything like it. There should have been something, an owl, a cricket, the distant howl of a coyote. Instead, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the whisper of fabric as one of us shifted in their sleep. I must have dozed eventually because I woke to the sound of someone moving around outside the tent. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite. But the steps were wrong somehow. Too soft, like bare feet on the wet earth, and spaced too far apart as if whoever was walking had an unnaturally long stride. "Jake?" I whispered. "Sarah?" "What?" Jake's voice came from right beside me, groggy with sleep. "Someone's outside." We lay there in the darkness, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel a presence just beyond the thin wall of our tent. My heart hammered against my ribs as we waited, every nerve stretched taut. Then Sarah screamed. Her shriek cut through the night like a blade, high and terrified and abruptly cut off. Jake and I scrambled for our flashlights, our hands shaking as we fumbled with the zippers. By the time we got out of the tent, Sarah was sitting up in her sleeping bag, wide-eyed and breathing hard. "What happened?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Something touched my face," she gasped. "Something cold, like fingers, but—" She shuddered. The tent was closed. How could something touch my face? We checked the tent thoroughly with our flashlights. No holes, no gaps, nothing that could explain how something could have reached inside. The zippers were still sealed tight. "Bad dream," Jake said, but his voice was shaky. "This place, it's getting to all of us." But I'd seen Sarah's face in the beam of my flashlight, and I knew she hadn't been dreaming. There were marks on her cheek, 4 parallel lines, faint but visible, like someone had dragged their fingernails across her skin. None of us slept after that. We sat huddled together in the tent, flashlights pointed in different directions, waiting for dawn. But when morning finally came, it brought no relief. The light that filtered through the canopy was gray and weak, as if the sun itself was struggling to penetrate the forest's gloom. "We should head back," Sarah said as we packed up our gear. The marks on her face were more pronounced in the daylight, 4 distinct scratches that definitely hadn't been there before. "One more night," Jake insisted. "We came here to disconnect. Remember? Besides, we're probably just spooked because of the weird silence. Tonight we'll get a fire going, and everything will feel normal again." I wanted to agree with Sarah, but Jake had always been the leader of our little group, and old habits die hard. Against my better judgment, I helped him convince her to stay another night. The day hike was surreal. We followed what Jake claimed was a trail deeper into the forest, but I was increasingly convinced we were just wandering through the trees. The GPS units continued to malfunction, showing us in impossible locations, sometimes indicating we were underwater, other times placing us hundreds of miles away. Our phones had died completely during the night, despite being fully charged when we went to sleep. "Look at this," Sarah called out around midday. She was standing beside what looked like another campsite, a clearing with the remains of a fire pit and some scattered debris. But as we got closer, the details became disturbing. The fire pit was full of bones. Animal bones, I told myself, though some looked uncomfortably human-like. The debris wasn't camping gear, but personal belongings. A wallet, some jewelry, a child's stuffed animal black with mold and decay. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." But when we tried to retrace our steps, the forest seemed different. Trees we'd passed earlier were gone, replaced by others. The marshy ground that had squelched under our feet on the way in was now firm and dry. Paths that should have led back to our original campsite instead curved away into unknown territory. "This is impossible," Jake said, staring at his compass. The needle was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. We wandered for hours, and I began to notice something else disturbing. The forest was too perfect. Every tree trunk was identical in circumference. Every branch hung at the same angle. The spacing between trees was mathematical in its precision. It was as if we'd walked into some vast, living geometry problem. By the time we found our way back to what we thought was our campsite, the weak daylight was already fading. But something was wrong. Our tent was there, our gear was there, but they were arranged differently. The tent that we'd struggled to stake down the night before was now perfectly taut, the guy lines forming exact angles. Our backpacks, which we'd left leaning against a fallen log, were now standing upright in a perfect row. "Did you guys?" I started to ask, but the looks on Jake and Sarah's faces told me they were just as confused as I was. "Maybe we're at the wrong campsite," Sarah suggested, but we all knew that wasn't possible. My jacket was still hanging from the tree branch where I'd left it that morning. We set up for another night, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. This time, the fire lit immediately. Too well, burning with strange blue and green flames that cast eerie shadows dancing between the trees. The silence was even more oppressive than before, if that was possible. "I keep feeling like we're being watched," Sarah said, glancing nervously at the tree line. I knew what she meant. There was a weight to the darkness beyond our fire, a sense of presence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Occasionally, I thought I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. "We're leaving first thing in the morning," I said. "No discussion." Jake nodded, and for once he didn't argue. We took turns keeping watch through the night, though I'm not sure what we thought we were watching for. During my shift, around what must have been 3 in the morning, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Voices coming from the forest. Familiar voices. My own voice, Jake's voice, Sarah's voice, having a conversation I remembered from earlier that day. But the words were slightly wrong, the inflections off, like a recording that had been altered. The voices were coming from different directions, as if there were multiple copies of us scattered throughout the trees, all talking at once in this twisted echo of our earlier conversation. I woke the others, and we sat in terrified silence as our own voices drifted through the darkness, repeating fragments of things we'd said, sometimes mixing up who had said what, sometimes adding words we'd never spoken at all. When dawn finally came, Jake was gone. His sleeping bag was empty but still warm, unzipped from the inside. His boots were missing, but his jacket and backpack were still in the tent. There were no footprints leading away from the campsite, no signs of a struggle, nothing to indicate where he might have gone. "Jake!" Sarah called out, her voice echoing strangely in the oppressive quiet. "Jake!" The only response was our own voices calling back to us from deep in the forest, distorted and wrong. We searched for hours, expanding our circle wider and wider, but found no trace of him. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. By afternoon, panic was setting in. "We have to go for help," I said. "We'll mark our trail and come back with a search party." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. We packed our essential gear and started hiking back toward what we hoped was the direction of the main trail. But the forest seemed to shift around us, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks vanishing and reappearing in impossible locations. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours when we heard Jake's voice calling from behind us. "Hey, wait up!" We turned around, and there he was, jogging toward us with his familiar lopsided grin. Relief flooded through me as he caught up to us, slightly out of breath. "Where the hell have you been?" Sarah demanded, anger replacing worry. "Sorry, I woke up early and decided to scout ahead for the trail out. Found it too. It's just about a mile that way." He pointed back in the direction he'd come from. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Jake looked exactly like Jake, sounded exactly like Jake, but there was something wrong about the way he moved, the way he held his head, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You left without saying anything?" I asked. "We've been looking for you for hours." "Hours?" Jake looked genuinely confused. "I've only been gone for like 20 minutes." But the sun was clearly lower in the sky than it had been when we'd first noticed he was missing, and Jake's clothes were completely clean and dry, despite the muddy, marshy terrain we'd been struggling through. "You're not wearing your boots," Sarah observed. Jake looked down at his feet. He was wearing sneakers, expensive-looking ones I'd never seen before. "Yeah, my boots were giving me blisters. Found these in my pack." But I'd helped Jake pack his backpack, and I knew he'd only brought the one pair of hiking boots. We followed Jake back toward our campsite, but the path he led us down was different from any we'd taken before. The trees were wrong, the terrain was wrong, everything was wrong. When we finally reached what Jake insisted was our campsite, I barely recognized it. The tent was there, and our gear, but they were arranged in a perfect geometric pattern that would have taken hours to achieve. "This isn't our campsite," I said. "Sure it is," Jake replied, that strange smile never leaving his face. "Don't be paranoid, Mike." But Jake had never called me Mike. Not once in the 3 years I'd known him. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something was fundamentally wrong with Jake, but I couldn't prove it. He looked right, mostly sounded right, but there were little things. He didn't remember our inside jokes. He called Sarah by her full name instead of the nickname he'd always used. He ate his food differently, held his water bottle with the wrong hand. I caught Sarah watching him too, her eyes wide with the fear she was trying to hide. Around midnight, Jake stood up from where he'd been sitting by the fire. "I'm going to gather more wood," he announced. "I'll come with you," I said quickly. "No need." His smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. "I'll be right back." He walked into the forest, and I counted the seconds until he was out of sight. Then I grabbed Sarah's arm. "That's not Jake," I whispered. "I know," she whispered back, her voice shaking. "When he came back today, he didn't know about the scratches on my face. The real Jake would have asked about them immediately." We sat there in the firelight, waiting for whatever was wearing Jake's face to return. The fire burned with those same unnatural blue and green flames, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames themselves. When Jake came back 20 minutes later, he was carrying an armload of wood, but it was the wrong kind. Pine branches when we'd been burning hardwood, and they were bone dry despite the dampness that pervaded everything else in the forest. "Found some good stuff," he said cheerfully, dumping the wood beside the fire. As he bent over, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. There was no dirt on his shoes, no moisture on his clothes, despite the fact that he'd just spent 20 minutes walking through muddy forest in near total darkness. But worse than that, much worse, was what I glimpsed when his shirt rode up as he bent over. His back was wrong. Instead of skin, there was something that looked like bark, rough and dark, with deep grooves running vertically along his spine. I caught Sarah's eye and saw that she'd noticed it too. Her face had gone white. "I think I'll turn in," fake Jake said, stretching and yawning in an exaggerated way. "Big day tomorrow." He crawled into the tent, and within minutes we heard what sounded like snoring. But it was too regular, too mechanical, like a recording of someone sleeping rather than actual sleep. Sarah and I sat by the fire in terrified silence. Every few minutes one of us would catch the other's eye, and I could see the same question in her expression that was burning in my mind. What do we do? "We have to run," Sarah finally whispered, so quietly I had to lean in to hear her. I nodded. We quietly gathered our essential gear. Water, minimal food, our headlamps. The thing in the tent continued its mechanical snoring, but I had the terrible feeling it was listening to every move we made. We slipped away from the campsite as quietly as we could, using our headlamps on the lowest setting. Once we were what felt like a safe distance away, we started moving faster, crashing through underbrush in our desperation to put distance between us and whatever was wearing our friend's face. We'd been running for maybe an hour when Sarah grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" I stopped and listened. Behind us, coming from the direction of our abandoned campsite, I could hear Jake's voice calling out, "Mike, Sarah, where are you guys? Come back." But there was something wrong with the voice. It was too loud, carrying impossibly far through the dense forest. And there was an echo to it, as if multiple people were calling with Jake's voice from different locations. We kept running. The forest seemed to go on forever, an endless maze of identical trees and marshy ground. Our headlamps created a small bubble of light around us, but beyond that was absolute darkness. I began to notice that we were seeing the same landmarks over and over: a distinctive gnarled tree, a fallen log, a large boulder covered in moss. It was as if we were running in circles, though we'd been careful to keep moving in a straight line. "Mike! Sarah!" The calls were getting closer, and now I could hear crashing sounds in the underbrush behind us. Whatever was chasing us was moving fast, faster than any human should be able to move through this terrain. We came to a stop in a small clearing, breathing hard and trying to get our bearings. That's when Sarah screamed. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just outside the reach of our headlamps, was Jake. But this Jake was wrong in ways that made my mind reel. He was too tall, his limbs too long, his head tilted at an impossible angle. His smile stretched across his entire face, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that gleamed wetly in the light. "There you are," he said, and his voice was like wind through dead leaves. "I've been looking everywhere for you." We ran. Behind us, the thing that wore Jake's face gave chase, and the sounds it made as it moved through the forest were not human. There was the snap of branches, the wet squelch of feet in mud, but also other sounds, a chittering like insects, a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to stretch and compress in the darkness. Sometimes it felt like we'd been running for hours, other times like only minutes had passed. The forest around us became increasingly surreal. Trees grew at impossible angles, their branches forming geometric patterns against the sky. The ground beneath our feet shifted from mud to stone to what felt like metal. We finally collapsed beside a small stream, gasping for breath. The water was perfectly clear and completely still, reflecting the weak light of our headlamps like a mirror. "I think we lost it," I panted. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. She was staring at her reflection in the still water, and I saw her face go white. "Mike," she whispered, "look at the water." I followed her gaze and felt my heart stop. Our reflections were there, but they were wrong. My reflection's eyes were solid black, empty holes in its face. Sarah's reflection was smiling that same too-wide smile we'd seen on the thing wearing Jake's face. And behind our reflections, barely visible in the dark water, was a third figure. Jake, the real Jake, standing behind us with his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes wide with terror and pleading. I spun around, but there was nothing behind us except darkness. When I looked back at the water, Jake's reflection was gone, and our own reflections had returned to normal. "We have to get out of here," Sarah gasped. "This place, it's not natural. It's like it's alive, like it's playing with us." We followed the stream, hoping it would lead us towards civilization, but it seemed to wind endlessly through the forest without going anywhere. The trees pressed closer, their branches forming a canopy so thick that our headlamps were the only source of light. That's when we heard it. Singing. A woman's voice, high and sweet, drifting through the darkness. The melody was beautiful but somehow wrong, with notes that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should and harmonies that made my teeth ache. "Don't listen," I told Sarah, but I could see she was already drawn to the sound. Her eyes were glazed and she was moving toward the source of the singing like a sleepwalker. I grabbed her arm and shook her. "Sarah, snap out of it." She blinked and looked at me with confusion. "Did you hear that? Someone's singing. Maybe it's help." "No," I said firmly. "Whatever's making that sound, it's not human." But even as I said it, I could feel the pull of the melody. It was beautiful, hypnotic, promising rest and comfort after our terrifying flight through the darkness. It took all my willpower to resist walking toward it. The singing continued for what felt like hours, always seeming to come from just ahead of us, just around the next bend in the stream. Sometimes there was one voice, sometimes many, harmonizing in ways that human voices couldn't achieve. And sometimes, mixed in with the ethereal melody, I thought I heard Jake's voice, screaming. Dawn came slowly, the weak gray light filtering through the canopy like water through cloth. But instead of bringing relief, the daylight only made our situation more obviously hopeless. We were completely lost, our gear was running low, and the forest around us looked nothing like any natural woodland I'd ever seen. The trees were all identical now, perfectly straight and evenly spaced, like soldiers in formation. The ground was flat and barren, covered in a thin layer of what looked like ash. There were no birds, no insects, no signs of life except for us. "This isn't real," Sarah said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and fear. "None of this is real. Forests don't look like this." But I could feel the ash beneath my feet, smell the strange metallic scent in the air, taste the wrongness on my tongue. Real or not, we were trapped here. We kept walking, following what might have been a path through the geometric forest. Our water was running low, and we hadn't eaten anything substantial since the morning Jake disappeared. Every step was an effort, and I could see that Sarah was reaching the end of her endurance. That's when we saw the cabin. It sat in a clearing ahead of us, a small log structure with smoke rising from its chimney. It looked completely normal, completely human, completely out of place in this alien landscape. "It could be a trap," I said, but even as I spoke I was walking toward it. We were beyond caring about traps. We needed shelter, water, food, and possibly help. Sarah knocked on the door, and it opened immediately, as if whoever was inside had been waiting for us. Standing in the doorway was an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She looked so normal, so human, that I almost wept with relief. "You poor dears," she said in a grandmotherly voice. Come in. You look exhausted." The inside of the cabin was exactly what you'd expect. Rustic furniture, a wood-burning stove, shelves lined with mason jars and books. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Hollow and busied herself making us tea and sandwiches. "Don't get many visitors out here," she said as she worked, "especially not young folks who look like they've seen a ghost." "We're lost," Sarah said. "We've been hiking in Blackbird State Forest, but somehow we got turned around." Mrs. Hollow paused in her tea preparation. "Blackbird Forest? Oh, honey, that's miles from here. You're in Carpenter's Woods now." I'd never heard of Carpenter's Woods, and a quick check of my dead phone's last cached map didn't show any such place in Delaware. "Could we use your phone?" I asked. "We need to call for help. Our friend is missing." Mrs. Hollow's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Oh, I'm afraid I don't have a phone, dear. Never had much use for modern conveniences out here. But don't you worry about your friend. I'm sure he'll turn up." There was something about the way she said it that made my skin crawl. We ate the sandwiches gratefully. They were delicious, though I couldn't identify the meat. We drank the tea, which had a strange bitter aftertaste but warmed us thoroughly. Mrs. Hollow chattered pleasantly about the weather, the forest, her garden, all perfectly normal conversation that should have put us at ease. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was the way she never seemed to blink, or how her shadow moved independently of her body, or the fact that every time I looked directly at her face, it seemed slightly different from what I'd seen in my peripheral vision. "You should rest," she said when we'd finished eating. "There's a spare room upstairs. Sleep for a few hours, and then I'll help you find your way back to civilization." The room she showed us to was small but comfortable, with 2 single beds and a window that looked out onto the forest. But when I tried to look through the window, all I could see was my own reflection staring back at me, even though it was still daylight outside. "Something's wrong with her," I whispered to Sarah once Mrs. Hollow had left us alone. "I know," Sarah whispered back. Did you see her hands when she was making the sandwiches? They were covered in dirt, like she'd been digging. I had noticed that, and more. Mrs. Hollow's fingernails were black with what looked like dried blood, and when she smiled, I caught glimpses of teeth that were too sharp, too pointed. "We can't stay here," I said, "but where else can we go? We're lost. We're exhausted, and whatever's out there in the forest." Sarah shuddered. I understood her dilemma. The forest was terrifying, alien, full of things that shouldn't exist, but this cabin, despite its appearance of safety, felt like a trap, a pretty cage for prey that had walked willingly inside. We pretended to sleep, lying on the beds with our eyes closed, listening to Mrs. Hollow moving around downstairs. She was humming the same melody we'd heard in the forest, the one that had almost lured Sarah away from me. And occasionally I heard other sounds, scraping like something heavy being dragged across the floor, and a rhythmic chopping that made me think of someone preparing meat. When night fell, Mrs. Hollow called up to us. "Dinner's ready, dears." We went downstairs to find the table set with candles and what looked like a feast. There was roasted meat that she claimed was venison, vegetables from her garden, fresh bread, and wine that tasted like it had been aged for decades. But as we ate, I noticed more wrong details. The meat was too tender, almost melting on the tongue, and it had a flavor I couldn't identify, rich and gamey, but with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. The vegetables looked normal but tasted wrong, like they'd been grown in contaminated soil. And the wine tasted like copper, like blood. "This is delicious," Sarah said, but I could see in her eyes that she was thinking the same thing I was. "My own recipe," Mrs. Hollow said, watching us eat with that same unwavering smile. "I've been perfecting it for years. The secret is in the preparation. You have to tenderize the meat just right." After dinner, she insisted we sit by the fire and tell her about ourselves, our lives, our families. But every question felt like she was gathering information for some ulterior purpose. When I mentioned my parents, she asked where they lived. When Sarah talked about her job, Mrs. Hollow wanted to know if anyone would miss her if she didn't come back. "People worry when you disappear," she said with apparent sympathy. "They send search parties, ask questions. Much better if people think you left of your own accord." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But the shadows were wrong, moving independently of the flames, forming shapes that looked almost human but grotesquely distorted. "I think we should head out first thing in the morning," I said. "We've imposed on your hospitality enough." Mrs. Hollow's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, but you can't leave yet. You haven't met my husband." "Your husband? He'll be so disappointed if he misses you. He's been looking forward to meeting you ever since you arrived." As if summoned by her words, we heard footsteps on the front porch, heavy, dragging steps that moved with an uneven rhythm. The door opened without anyone knocking, and in walked what had once been a man. He was tall and gaunt, with skin that looked like it had been stretched over his bones and then allowed to sag. His clothes were old and mildewed, hanging off his skeletal frame. But worst of all were his eyes. They were Jake's eyes, bright blue and terrified, set in this stranger's face. "Girls and boys," Mrs. Hollow said cheerfully, "I'd like you to meet my husband, Mr. Hollow. He used to be someone else, but we don't talk about that anymore." Mr. Hollow opened his mouth and Jake's voice came out screaming for help, but the words were wrong, broken up and reassembled into nonsense syllables that conveyed nothing but terror. "Help. Me. Please. Can't. Stop." Sarah bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door remained sealed as if it had been welded shut. I joined her, throwing my shoulder against the wood, but it was like hitting solid stone. Now, Mrs. Hollow said, her voice taking on a tone that sounded like fingernails on chalkboard. "No need to be rude. We're all going to be such good friends." Mr. Hollow lurched toward us, moving with that same uneven gait, As he got closer, I could see that his body was wrong in fundamental ways. His arms were too long, his fingers too many, his neck able to turn much further than any human neck should. But trapped inside this grotesque form, Jake's eyes looked out at us with desperate pleading. I grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace and swung it at Mr. Hollow's head. It connected with a sound like breaking pottery, and he staggered backward. A crack appeared across his face and something dark and viscous leaked out. "That's very rude," Mrs. Hollow said, and now her voice was a chorus of different tones, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "We're trying to be hospitable." Her face was changing too, features shifting and flowing like clay. Sometimes she looked like the kindly old woman who had welcomed us, sometimes like something with too many eyes and a mouth full of needle teeth. Mr. Hollow recovered from my blow and came at us again. This time I swung the poker at his knees and heard the satisfying crack of breaking bone. He fell, but immediately began pulling himself toward us with his arms, leaving a trail of that dark fluid behind him. "The window!" Sarah shouted. I grabbed one of the dining chairs and hurled it at the window with all my strength. The glass shattered, and cool night air rushed in. We scrambled through the opening, cutting ourselves on the remaining shards but not caring. Behind us, Mrs. Hollow was laughing, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "You can't leave," she called after us. "This is where you belong now. This is where everyone who enters the deep woods eventually ends up." We ran into the forest, our cuts bleeding freely, our hearts pounding with terror and adrenaline. Behind us, the cabin erupted into flames that burned with the same unnatural blue and green we'd seen in our campfire. But instead of consuming the structure, the flames seemed to be transforming it, reshaping it into something that hurt to look at directly. The forest had changed again. The geometric perfection was gone, replaced by something even worse. Trees that grew in spirals, their branches forming complex knots and patterns that seemed designed to trap the eye and confuse the mind. The ground beneath our feet was soft and yielding, like flesh, and occasionally I felt something moving beneath the surface. We ran without direction, guided only by the desperate need to put distance between ourselves and the horror behind us. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed meaningless in this place. Sometimes it felt like minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes like we'd been running forever. Eventually, exhaustion forced us to stop. We collapsed beside what looked like a normal oak tree, gasping for breath and trying to process what we'd experienced. "Jake," Sarah sobbed. "That was Jake in there, wasn't it? That thing had Jake's eyes." I nodded, unable to speak. Whatever had happened to our friend was worse than death. He was trapped inside that grotesque form, conscious and aware but unable to control his own body. "We have to help him," Sarah said. "How?" I asked. "How do we fight something like that? How do we even get out of here ourselves?" As if in answer to my question, I heard a sound that made my heart leap with hope, the distant rumble of an engine. A car, or maybe a truck, somewhere ahead of us through the trees. We stumbled toward the sound, pushing through underbrush that seemed to grab at our clothes and try to hold us back. The engine noise grew louder, and then we saw it. Headlights cutting through the darkness, moving along what looked like a road. We broke through the tree line and found ourselves standing beside a 2-lane highway. A pickup truck was approaching, and I waved my arms frantically to flag it down. The truck pulled over, and the driver rolled down his window. He was a middle-aged man with a concerned expression, exactly the kind of normal human being we desperately needed to see. "You folks okay?" he asked. "You look like you've been through hell." "Please," Sarah gasped. "We need help. We've been lost in the forest. Our friend is missing, and there are things in there that aren't human." The man's expression shifted from concern to something else. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Blackbird Forest?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "We went camping and—" "Get in," he said grimly. "Both of you, right now." We climbed into the cab of his truck, and he immediately pulled a U-turn and began driving away from the forest as fast as he dared on the winding road. "I'm Tom Breslin," he said as he drove. "I run a gas station about 10 miles from here. Been working this area for 15 years, and I've seen what comes out of those woods. Most folks don't believe the stories, but I know better." "What stories?" Sarah asked. "About the things that live in the deep forest. The old-timers called it the hollow ground, a place where reality gets thin and other things bleed through. Most people who go in there never come out. The ones who do—" He glanced at us in his rearview mirror. "Well, they're usually not the same people who went in." "Our friend," I said. "Jake. He's still in there." Tom's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "If he's been in there for more than 24 hours, he's gone. Not dead, that would be a mercy, but gone all the same." He drove us to his gas station where he called the police and the Forest Service. But when the authorities arrived, their response was exactly what Tom had predicted. They listened to our story with barely concealed skepticism, taking notes and making sympathetic noises, but clearly thinking we were either lying or suffering from some kind of shared delusion. "We'll organize a search party," the lead ranger assured us. "But I have to tell you, people get turned around in those woods all the time. Your friend probably just got lost and is hunkered down somewhere waiting for help." They did search for 3 days. They found our abandoned campsite, our gear scattered and partially buried under a thin layer of soil that shouldn't have had time to accumulate. They found no trace of Jake, no trail to follow, no clues about what might have happened to him. On the 4th day, they called off the search. Sarah and I gave our statements to the police multiple times, but I could see in their eyes that they thought we were hiding something, that maybe we'd had some kind of falling out with Jake and were covering up a crime. The physical evidence, our cuts, our exhaustion, our obvious terror, supported the idea that something traumatic had happened, but our story was too unbelievable for them to accept. We went home to our normal lives, but nothing was normal anymore. I quit my job and moved across the country, but the nightmares followed me. Every night, I dream about Jake's eyes looking out from that twisted form, pleading for help I couldn't give. I dream about Mrs. Hollow's shifting face and Mr. Hollow's broken gait. I dream about the geometric forest and the singing that promised rest but delivered only horror. Sarah calls me sometimes, usually late at night when the dreams get too bad. We've both done research trying to find some explanation for what we experienced. We found scattered references to similar phenomena, people disappearing in forests, witnesses reporting impossible experiences, local legends about places where reality breaks down. But we've never found anything that could help Jake. That was 6 months ago. Last week, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard Jake's voice, clear as day. "Mike," he said, and his voice was exactly as I remembered it. "Mike, I need help. I'm still here, still in the forest. They won't let me leave, but sometimes I can reach out, make contact. You have to come back. You have to help me." I hung up immediately, my hands shaking. But the phone rang again. "Please," Jake's voice said. "I'm trapped. They're making me into something else piece by piece, but I'm still me. I'm still here. You and Sarah are the only ones who know the truth. You're the only ones who can help." I've been getting calls like that every day since then. Sometimes it's Jake's voice. Sometimes it's Sarah's voice telling me she's going back to the forest. Sometimes it's my own voice saying things I never said. I've disconnected my phone, but it keeps ringing anyway. And I know, with a certainty that terrifies me, that eventually I'm going to answer it. Eventually, the pull will be too strong to resist. Whatever's in that forest isn't done with me yet. It's been patient, letting me think I escaped, letting me believe I was safe. But deep down, I know the truth. Once you enter the hollow ground, you never really leave. The forest is calling me back, and sooner or later, I'm going to go. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the autumn of 2024, in the remote pine forests near Blackbird State Forest in Delaware, where the Chesapeake Bay meets endless stretches of marsh and woodland that seem to swallow sound itself. I should have listened to the park ranger who warned us about the missing hikers. I should have paid attention when Jake couldn't find our campsite on his GPS, even though we'd been there before. Most of all, I should have turned back the moment I saw Thomas staring into those woods with that empty, hungry expression I'd never seen on his face before. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It started as a simple weekend camping trip. Me, my college roommate Jake Morrison, and our friend Thomas Reed had been planning this getaway for months. We'd all been working dead-end office jobs since graduation, and the stress was eating us alive. Jake suggested we revisit our old camping spot near the Delaware Bay, where we'd gone during our senior year. Back then, it had been perfect, isolated enough for privacy but not so remote that we'd worry about getting lost. The drive down from Wilmington should have taken us 2 hours. Instead, it took nearly 4, with Jake's GPS leading us in circles through increasingly narrow back roads that didn't match any of our maps. The autumn sun was already sinking low when we finally found what looked like the right turnoff, a barely visible dirt track that disappeared into a wall of towering loblolly pines. "This doesn't look right," Jake muttered, squinting through the windshield at the darkening forest. His usually confident demeanor had cracked somewhere around the 3rd time we'd passed the same abandoned gas station. "It's the right area," Thomas said from the back seat, though his voice carried an odd certainty that made me glance back at him. He was staring out the window with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. "I can feel it." I laughed nervously. "Feel it? What are you, part bloodhound?" Thomas didn't respond. His eyes never left the tree line. We parked at what appeared to be a small clearing about a mile down the dirt road. The moment I stepped out of Jake's Jeep, I felt something wrong with the air itself. It was too still, too quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling through the pine needles above us. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest was actively absorbing sound. "Where's the bay?" Jake asked, consulting his phone. "We should be able to see water from here." I pulled out my own phone and cursed. No signal, and my GPS showed only a blank gray screen where the map should be. "Must be interference from the trees," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. Thomas was already unloading gear from the back of the Jeep with an eagerness that struck me as odd. He'd been the most reluctant to come on this trip, complaining about work deadlines and weekend plans with his girlfriend Sarah. Now he moved with the focused energy of someone who had found exactly what they were looking for. "Tom, slow down," I said, grabbing his arm as he shouldered his massive hiking pack. "We need to figure out where we are first." He turned to look at me, and for just a moment I could have sworn his eyes reflected the dying sunlight like an animal's. But then he blinked, and the illusion was gone. "We're exactly where we need to be, Mike," he said, smiling. But the smile was all wrong. Too wide, lasting too long. "Trust me." We set up camp in the clearing as darkness fell around us like a heavy curtain. Jake struggled with his tent poles while muttering increasingly creative curses. I focused on building a fire ring, grateful for the familiar task. Only Thomas seemed completely at ease, his tent appearing around him with practiced efficiency. The fire was what finally made me admit something was seriously wrong. No matter how carefully I arranged the kindling, no matter how much dry tinder I added, the flames kept dying down to sullen orange embers. When they did flare up, they burned with colors I'd never seen before, deep greens and purples that made my eyes water to look at directly. "This wood must be damp," I said, more to fill the oppressive silence than because I believed it. Jake snorted. "Mike, we haven't had rain in 2 weeks. That wood's drier than my dating life." I was about to respond when Thomas spoke from across the fire. "Sometimes fires burn different colors when they're feeding on more than just wood." We both stared at him. He was sitting perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, watching the flames with that same predatory intensity. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jake asked. Thomas's smile returned, slow and unsettling. "Old stories, native legends about these woods. They say the Lenape avoided this area, called it the hungry place. Something about spirits that could never be satisfied." Since when do you know anything about Native American legends? I asked. Thomas had majored in accounting. His idea of cultural enrichment was watching documentaries about tax law. "I've been reading," he said simply. "Learning about the history of this place. Did you know there were reports of missing settlers here as early as 1692? Entire families would just vanish. They'd find the houses intact, meals half-eaten, but no signs of struggle, no bodies, nothing." The fire popped and hissed, sending up sparks that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should allow. I found myself leaning away from the flames without quite knowing why. "You're creeping me out." "Man," Jake said with a forced laugh. "Save the ghost stories for when we're drunk." But Thomas wasn't done. The last official report was in 1934, a family of 5 camping near here. The rescue teams found their campsite 3 days later. Everything was still there: clothes, food, even their car keys. But the family was gone. The only strange thing was that their sleeping bags were empty, but unzipped from the inside. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool October air. "How do you know all this?" Thomas turned his attention to me, and in the shifting firelight his face looked gaunt, almost skeletal. "I told you, I've been reading, learning about what this place really is." That night, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to sounds that couldn't possibly be coming from any normal forest. Soft whispers that might have been wind through branches, except there was no wind. Footsteps circling our campsite that were too light for any large animal, too rhythmic for any small one, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to Jake shaking my shoulder. Gray dawn light was filtering through the tent walls. "Mike, wake up, we've got a problem." I stumbled out of my tent to find Jake standing next to the cold remains of our fire, holding his phone with a bewildered expression. "What time is it?" I asked, checking my own phone. The screen was dead black. "That's just it," Jake said. "My phone says it's Thursday." "Thursday? That's impossible. We just got here yesterday, which was Friday. Look at this." He showed me his phone screen. "Thursday, October 17th, 2024. But I know we left Friday morning. I remember because I had to skip my meeting with Henderson." I stared at the date, feeling something cold and heavy settle in my stomach. My own phone was completely dead, wouldn't even respond to the power button. "Maybe your phone's broken." "Maybe," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Mike, where's Thomas?" I looked around the campsite. Thomas's tent was still there, but the flap was hanging open, revealing an empty interior. His sleeping bag was crumpled at the foot of the tent, and, like the story he'd told the night before, it was unzipped from the inside. "Tom," I called out. "Thomas!" My voice seemed to die just a few feet from my mouth, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. We searched the immediate area, calling his name, but found no trace of him. It was as if he'd simply vanished into the woods. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We need to find a ranger station. Get help." I nodded, but even as we started breaking down camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sensation of unseen eyes tracking our every movement made my skin crawl. We packed quickly and started back toward where we'd left the Jeep. The dirt road should have been a straight shot, maybe a 10-minute walk. Instead, we found ourselves wandering through increasingly dense forest, the path seeming to shift and branch in ways that defied memory. "This isn't right," Jake said after what felt like an hour of walking. "We should have reached the car by now." I was about to agree when I heard something that made my blood freeze. Laughter. Soft, musical laughter coming from somewhere ahead of us. It sounded like Thomas. "Tom?" Jake called out, relief evident in his voice. "Thomas, where the hell are you?" The laughter came again, closer this time, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. A hunger that made my instincts scream danger. "Jake, wait," I said, grabbing his arm as he started toward the sound. "Something's wrong." That's when we saw him. Thomas emerged from behind a massive pine tree about 30 yards ahead of us, but the sight of him made me stumble backward. He looked wrong in ways I struggled to process. His clothes were the same. His face was the same, but there was something fundamentally different about the way he moved. Too fluid, too graceful, like a predator that had learned to mimic human motion. "There you guys are," he said, his voice carrying perfectly through the still air. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "Where did you go?" Jake demanded, anger replacing relief. "We woke up, and you were just gone. We've been searching for hours." Thomas tilted his head to one side, the movement too sharp, too quick. "Hours? I've only been gone a few minutes. I went to gather firewood." But he wasn't carrying any wood. His hands were empty, and they seemed paler than I remembered, with fingernails that looked longer and somehow sharper. "We need to get back to the car," I said, not taking my eyes off Thomas. Something about his posture, the way he stood perfectly still while talking, reminded me of a spider waiting at the center of its web. "Oh, we don't need to worry about the car," Thomas said, that unsettling smile spreading across his face again. I found something much more interesting, something that's been waiting for us. "What are you talking about?" Jake asked, but I could hear the unease creeping into his voice now, too. Thomas's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "The hungry place, Jake? It's been so long since it had visitors, since it had a proper meal." That's when he moved. I've tried to describe what happened next to the therapists, to the police, to anyone who would listen. Thomas didn't run toward us so much as flow, covering the 30 yards between us in what seemed like a single bound. But it wasn't Thomas anymore. Couldn't be Thomas. The thing that reached us had too many joints in its arms, too many teeth in its mouth, and eyes that burned with a starving madness I'd never seen in any human face. Jake screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen log. The thing that had been Thomas landed on top of him with impossible grace, and Jake's screams took on a different quality. Pain and terror and something else. The sound of someone realizing they were about to die. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush like a panicked animal, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my lungs burning with the effort. Behind me, Jake's screams cut off abruptly, replaced by wet, tearing sounds that I tried desperately not to imagine. I don't know how long I ran. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, each tree identical to the last. The path, if there ever had been a path, completely lost. My phone was still dead, my compass spun wildly without settling on any direction, and the sun remained hidden behind a canopy so thick it might as well have been midnight. When I finally collapsed against a moss-covered boulder, gasping for breath, I realized I could no longer hear anything behind me. No pursuit, no sounds of feeding, nothing. The forest had returned to its unnatural silence. That's when I noticed the smell. It started as just a faint whiff of something unpleasant, like meat left too long in a warm car. But as I sat there, trying to catch my breath and figure out where I was, the smell grew stronger, sweeter, more rotten. I forced myself to stand and look around, dreading what I might find. The source of the smell was coming from a depression in the ground about 20 feet away, hidden by a fallen tree and thick undergrowth. As I approached, flies began to buzz around my head in increasing numbers. What I found in that shallow pit will haunt me for the rest of my life. Bodies. Dozens of them in various stages of decay. Some were obviously old, little more than bones and scraps of clothing. Others were fresher, their faces still recognizable as human despite the damage. And there, near the top of the pile, I saw clothing I recognized. Jake's red flannel shirt, the one he'd bought specifically for this trip. I vomited until there was nothing left in my stomach, then dry heaved until my ribs ached. When I finally managed to lift my head, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Fresh marks in the soft earth around the pit. Drag marks leading away from the pile, and, at the end of those marks, disturbed soil that looked like something had been recently buried, something the size of a human body. The rational part of my mind tried to process what I was seeing. Jake couldn't be buried here. I'd just seen him attacked less than an hour ago. But time seemed to have no meaning in this place, and the evidence was right in front of me. I started digging with my bare hands. 3 feet down, I found Jake's face. His eyes were open, staring up at me with an expression of absolute terror. But worse than that, much worse, was the fact that he was still breathing. His chest rose and fell in slow, shallow movements, and when he saw me, his mouth opened in a soundless scream. He was alive, buried alive, and from the looks of his injuries, he'd been conscious for the entire experience. I dug frantically, trying to free him, but as I cleared the dirt from his body, I saw the extent of the damage. His arms were gone, torn away at the shoulders. His legs ended in ragged stumps just below the knees. Whatever had done this hadn't just attacked him. It had systematically mutilated him, keeping him alive through the process. "Jake, oh God, Jake, I'm going to get you out of here," I whispered, though even as I said it, I knew there was no way he could survive his injuries. His mouth moved, and I leaned closer to hear. His voice was barely a whisper, more breath than sound. "Run," he managed. It's coming back." That's when I heard the laughter again. The same musical sound that had led us to our doom, but closer now. Much closer. I looked up to see Thomas, or the thing wearing Thomas's face, standing at the edge of the pit. But now it wasn't even trying to maintain the human disguise. Its limbs were elongated and twisted, its fingers extended into black claws, and its mouth had opened far wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "I was wondering when you'd find this place," it said, and its voice was a harmony of tones, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. "This is where I keep my collection, all the friends I've made over the years." "What are you?" I asked, backing away from Jake's partially buried form. "Hungry," it said simply. "I'm always so hungry, and you people make it so easy. You come into my forest, you make yourselves comfortable, and then you trust so completely. Thomas trusted me right up until the end. Even when I was wearing his skin, he thought he could fight me from the inside." The thing that had been Thomas began to circle the pit, moving with predatory grace. "But you're different, Michael. You noticed things the others didn't. You felt the wrongness. That makes you special." "Stay away from me," I said, grabbing a thick branch from the ground. It laughed, and the sound was like wind chimes made of bones. "Oh, I'm not going to kill you, Michael. Not yet. You're going to help me." "Never." "You will," it said with absolute certainty, "because if you don't, I'll keep your friend Jake alive down there for a very long time, and I'll make sure he stays conscious for every minute of it." I looked down at Jake, saw the pleading in his eyes, and felt my resolve crumble. "What do you want?" "I want you to leave," the creature said. "Go back to the world of people and cars and cell phones. But remember what you've seen here. Remember what happened to your friends. And when the hunger gets too strong, when I need fresh meat, I want you to bring me more." "I'll never." "You will," it interrupted. "Because if you don't, I'll come looking for you. And when I find you, I'll make sure everyone you've ever cared about ends up in this pit. Your family, your co-workers, that girl you've been wanting to ask out. Sarah, isn't it? Thomas told me all about her." The way it said Sarah's name made my skin crawl. The creature had access to all of Thomas's memories, all his knowledge about our lives. "How do I know you won't just kill them anyway?" "You don't," it said with that horrible smile. "But this way, they might live. Refuse me, and they definitely won't." I stared down at Jake, watching the light slowly fade from his eyes. He was dying, and there was nothing I could do to save him. The creature was offering me a choice between saving strangers or saving the people I loved, and we both knew what I would choose. How would it work?" I asked, hating myself for the words. "Simple. I'll give you a way to contact me. When I call, you bring me someone. Hikers, campers, anyone who won't be missed immediately. You lead them here, and then you leave. Clean and simple. And if I refuse? The creature's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of such malevolent hunger that I stumbled backward. Then you join your friends in the pit, and I start hunting everyone you've ever met. Your choice, Michael. I closed my eyes, trying to think of any other option, any way out of this nightmare. But Jake's labored breathing was getting weaker, and I could feel the creature's patience wearing thin. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, I'll do it." The creature's smile returned, wider than ever. "I knew you would. You're a survivor, Michael. That's what makes you useful." It reached into what remained of Thomas's jacket and pulled out an old cell phone, the kind with physical buttons that nobody used anymore. "This will work anywhere, even places with no signal. When it rings, you answer. When I give you instructions, you follow them. Simple." I took the phone with trembling hands. It was heavier than it should have been, and it felt warm against my skin, like it was alive. "The first time, I'll be generous," the creature continued. "You have 6 months to find someone. After that, the timeline gets shorter. And Michael, don't even think about going to the police or trying to warn anyone. I'll know, and the consequences will be unpleasant." "How will I find you again?" I asked, looking around at the featureless forest. "You won't need to. When you bring them to the old logging road, the one where you parked, I'll find you. Just make sure they follow you into the woods willingly. It tastes better when they're not afraid at first." The creature began to change as I watched, its borrowed features melting and shifting like wax. Within moments, it looked exactly like Thomas again, down to the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident. "See you soon, Michael," it said in Thomas's voice, "and remember, 6 months." Then it simply faded into the forest, leaving me alone with Jake's dying breaths and the stench of the charnel pit. I don't remember the walk back to the Jeep. My next clear memory is sitting behind the wheel on Route 13, calling 911 on my miraculously functional phone. I told the police that we'd gotten separated while hiking, that I'd searched for hours before finally giving up and seeking help. The search teams found no trace of Jake or Thomas, just like the creature had said they wouldn't. The official report listed them as missing hikers, presumed lost in the vast wilderness areas around the Delaware Bay. The case was closed after 6 weeks. That was 3 months ago. The phone rings every few days now, but when I answer, there's only silence on the other end. I think it's testing me, making sure I'll respond when the time comes. Sometimes I catch myself looking at strangers differently, assessing how much they'd be missed, how easy it would be to convince them to go camping. I've tried to convince myself that I could fight back, that I could find a way to destroy the creature. But every time I consider it, I think about Sarah, about my parents, about everyone I care about ending up in that pit while still breathing. The worst part is the dreams. Every night I see Jake's face staring up at me from the dirt, his mouth moving in that soundless scream. And sometimes, in the dreams, I'm the one burying him. Sometimes I'm the one who led him there. 3 months left. I've started researching missing persons cases, looking for people who fit the profile. Loners, drifters, people whose disappearance wouldn't trigger massive search efforts. I tell myself I'm just being prepared, just making sure I understand what the creature wants. But deep down, I know the truth. I know that when that phone rings for real, when it gives me my instructions, I'm going to follow them. Because I'm not brave enough to sacrifice the people I love to save strangers. I'm not Thomas, who fought the thing even while it was wearing his skin. I'm not Jake, who tried to warn me even while dying in that horrible pit. I'm just Michael Williams, 28 years old, and I'm going to become a monster to keep the people I love safe from one. The phone hasn't rung yet today, but it's getting late, and when it does ring, I'll answer it. I'll say hello to the hunger in the pines, and I'll ask it what it needs me to do. Because some choices aren't really choices at all. They're just different kinds of damnation, and you pick the one you can live with. If you're reading this, If you somehow found my journal, don't come looking for me. Don't try to help. And whatever you do, stay away from the forests around Blackbird State Forest in Delaware. The hungry place is always looking for new friends. And now, so am I. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in October of last year, deep in the Redden State Forest of Delaware, where the pine trees grow so thick that sunlight barely penetrates even at midday. I'm telling this story because I need people to know what's really out there, lurking in those woods where the old logging trails dead end into nothing but darkness and the sound of your own heartbeat. It started as a simple weekend camping trip. My boyfriend Michael and I had been dating for 8 months, and he'd been pushing for us to do something more adventurous together. I'd always been the cautious type, the kind of person who checked the locks twice before bed and kept emergency supplies in my car, but Michael had this infectious enthusiasm that made me want to step outside my comfort zone. "Come on, Jen," he'd said, spreading topographic maps across my kitchen table. "When's the last time you did something that actually scared you? Something that made you feel alive?" Michael Thompson was everything I wasn't. Spontaneous, fearless, the kind of guy who would climb a water tower just to watch the sunrise. At 31, he had the lean build of someone who spent weekends rock climbing and mountain biking, and this easy confidence that drew people to him like moths to a flame. He worked as a wilderness guide during summers and taught high school biology the rest of the year. So when he suggested we camp in the remote section of Redden State Forest, I trusted his expertise. "The deep woods section is incredible," he explained, tracing his finger along unmarked trails on the map. "Most people stick to the main camping areas, but there are these old logging roads that lead to clearings where hardly anyone goes anymore. It's like stepping back in time." That should have been my first warning. The places where hardly anyone goes anymore usually have reasons for being avoided. We invited our friends Sarah Rodriguez and her girlfriend Amanda Wright to join us. Sarah was a nurse at the local hospital, practical and level-headed, with the kind of gallows humor that comes from working night shifts in the ER. Amanda worked in marketing and had never been camping in her life, but she was game for anything if it meant spending time with Sarah. They'd been together for 2 years and were in that phase where they still found each other's quirks endearing rather than annoying. The plan was simple. Drive out Friday afternoon, hike about 3 miles into the forest to a clearing Michael had marked on his GPS, set up camp, and spend the weekend disconnected from the world. No cell service, no social media, just the 4 of us, a campfire, and whatever stories we could tell under the stars. I remember the drive out there with perfect clarity, the way the suburban sprawl of Wilmington gradually gave way to farmland, then pine forest, then the kind of deep woods that seemed to swallow sound. We took Route 113 south through Georgetown, then turned onto increasingly narrow back roads until we reached the gravel access road that led into Redden State Forest. "Jesus," Amanda muttered from the back seat as Michael's truck bounced over another pothole. "Are you sure we're not trespassing?" "This is all public land," Michael assured her, though I noticed his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter as the road became rougher. "The state just doesn't maintain these access roads very well, keeps the crowds away." The forest pressed in around us, massive loblolly pines and sweet gums creating a canopy so thick it felt like driving through a green tunnel. Spanish moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and I caught glimpses of wildlife. A deer that bolted across the road, a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, something larger that crashed through the underbrush but stayed hidden. We parked at what Michael called the traditional trailhead. Really just a slightly wider spot in the road where someone had long ago placed a rusted metal sign reading, "Authorized Vehicles Only." The silence when he turned off the engine was absolute and oppressive, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant call of what might have been a bird. "God, it's quiet," Sarah said, shouldering her pack. "When's the last time any of us heard actual silence?" We loaded up our gear, tents, sleeping bags, camp stoves, enough food for 3 days, and set off down what Michael insisted was a well-established trail, though it looked more like a deer path to me. The woods were beautiful in that intimidating way that makes you feel very small and very temporary. Massive trees towered overhead, some easily 3 feet in diameter, and the forest floor was thick with decades of fallen leaves that muffled our footsteps. Michael led the way with his GPS device, occasionally checking the screen and making small course corrections. "The clearing should be about 2.5 miles in," he called back to us. "There's supposed to be a small stream nearby, so we'll have fresh water." The hike started easy enough. The old logging road was relatively flat and wide enough for us to walk 2 abreast. Amanda chatted nervously about work, clearly out of her element but trying to stay positive. Sarah pointed out different plants and trees, her scientific mind cataloging everything we passed. I found myself focusing on the sounds: the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional crack of a branch settling, the rustle of wind through the canopy. It was Sarah who first noticed that something was off. "Hey," she said, stopping suddenly after we'd been hiking for about an hour. "Does anyone else notice how quiet it is?" We all paused, listening. She was right. The normal sounds of a forest, birdsong, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, had gradually faded to nothing. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving us in a bubble of absolute silence that felt unnatural. "Maybe we're just deeper in than usual," Michael suggested, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Sometimes the wildlife gets spooked by human presence." "For a whole mile?" Sarah pressed. "I've been watching for the last 20 minutes. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It's like everything just left." Amanda laughed nervously. "Great. Are we walking into some kind of dead zone?" "Don't be dramatic," Michael said, but he was checking his GPS more frequently now. "Animals have territories and migration patterns. We probably just hit a quiet patch." We kept walking, but the oppressive silence followed us. What had started as a pleasant autumn hike was beginning to feel like a forced march into something we weren't prepared for. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches forming increasingly complex shadows that my peripheral vision kept interpreting as movement. About 30 minutes later, Michael stopped and frowned at his GPS. "That's weird," he muttered, tapping the screen. "According to this, we should have reached the clearing by now." "Maybe the trail curved more than you expected," I suggested, though privately I was starting to wonder if we were lost. Michael shook his head, showing us the device. "See, we've been following this bearing pretty consistently. We should have covered the distance, but..." He gestured around us at the unbroken forest. "Obviously, we haven't reached it yet." "Technology fails," Sarah said pragmatically. "Remember, we're here to get away from screens anyway. Can we just pick a good spot and set up camp?" That's when Amanda pointed to something that made my stomach drop. Guys?" she said, her voice tight with confusion. "Is that our trail?" About 50 feet to our left, clearly visible through the trees, was another trail. Not just any trail. It looked exactly like the logging road we'd been following, complete with the same width, the same surface of packed earth and scattered leaves, even the same pattern of ruts from long-gone vehicle tires. "That's impossible," Michael said, but even as he spoke, I could see him trying to work out the geometry in his head. "We've been walking straight. If that's parallel to our trail, then there are 2 identical logging roads running through here," Sarah finished, "which doesn't make any sense." We stood there for a long moment, staring at the second trail. The rational explanation was that we'd somehow gotten turned around, that this was the same road we'd started on and we'd walked in a circle without realizing it. But Michael had been checking his compass regularly, and none of us remembered making any significant turns. "Maybe they're connected up ahead," Amanda suggested hopefully, "like a loop or something." Michael was already walking toward the other trail, his face set in the kind of determined expression that meant he was going to solve this problem through sheer force of will. The rest of us followed, crashing through the underbrush that separated the 2 paths. When we reached the second trail, I felt my skin crawl. It wasn't just similar to our original path. It was identical in every detail. The same worn ruts, the same scatter of leaves, even the same pattern of scuff marks where our boots had disturbed the surface. "This is our trail," Sarah said quietly. "These are our footprints." She was right. I could see the distinctive tread pattern from Michael's hiking boots, the smaller prints from Amanda's sneakers, the 4 sets of tracks that should have led us to this exact spot. But according to Michael's compass, we were facing the wrong direction entirely. "Okay," Michael said, his voice determinedly calm. "Okay, this is just geographic confusion. It happens in forests. The trees can mess with your sense of direction, make you think you're going straight when you're actually curving." "For over an hour?" I asked, "without any of us noticing?" He didn't have an answer for that. None of us did. Amanda was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "Should we head back?" "We're not lost," Michael said quickly. "Too quickly. We just need to reorient ourselves, get our bearings." But when he pulled out his compass, the needle spun lazily in a complete circle before settling on a reading that couldn't possibly be correct. According to the device, magnetic north was directly behind us, which would mean we'd been walking south for the entire hike, but we'd started by heading east into the forest. "The metal in the trees," Michael muttered, tapping the compass face. "Sometimes iron deposits can throw off magnetic readings." That might have been believable if we were in mining country, but this was Delaware pine forest. Sarah caught my eye and I could see she was thinking the same thing. "Let's just pick a direction and stick with it," I suggested. "If we keep going straight, we have to hit something eventually. A road, a fence line, something." We chose what Michael's now unreliable compass claimed was east and set off again, but the sense of wrongness was growing stronger with every step. The silence continued to press in around us, and I started noticing other things that didn't make sense. Trees that seemed to be in slightly different positions than I remembered. Branches that cast shadows in directions that didn't match the angle of the sun. Small details that might have been my imagination, except that I caught Sarah and Amanda noticing them too. After another hour of hiking, we found the clearing. It was perfect, exactly what Michael had described. A circular meadow about 100 feet across, surrounded by towering pines, with a small creek running along one edge. The grass was short and green, as if it had been recently mowed, and there were even the remains of an old fire ring made from stacked stones. "See," Michael said, and the relief in his voice was palpable. "I told you this place was worth the hike." But something about the clearing felt wrong to me. The grass was too perfect, too uniformly green for late October. The fire ring looked old, the stones weathered and moss-covered, but there was no debris inside it. No old ashes, no bits of charred wood, nothing to suggest it had ever actually been used. "How is the grass still green?" Sarah asked, echoing my thoughts. "We had our first frost 2 weeks ago." Michael was already unpacking his gear, determined to make this work. "Microclimates," he said. "The trees provide protection. Perfectly normal." Amanda knelt by the creek and dipped her hand in the water. "It's warm," she announced, sounding surprised. "Not hot, but definitely warmer than it should be." I walked to the edge of the clearing and looked back the way we'd come. The forest was so thick that I couldn't see more than 20 feet before the trees swallowed everything in green shadows. We could have been 20 miles from civilization or 20 feet from a highway. There was no way to tell. "Let's set up camp," Michael said with forced enthusiasm. "Get a fire going, cook some dinner. Everything will make more sense after we eat." We spent the next hour setting up our tents and organizing our gear. The familiarity of the routine was comforting, and I started to think that maybe Michael was right. Maybe we were just spooked by an unfamiliar environment, reading significance into perfectly normal forest phenomena. The sun was getting low when we finished, casting long shadows across the clearing. Michael had insisted on gathering firewood from the edge of the forest, though when he returned with an armload of dead branches, I noticed they were completely dry despite the morning rain we'd driven through. "Perfect burning wood," he announced, stacking the logs in the old fire ring. "This is going to be great." He was right about the wood. It caught immediately and burned with a clean, hot flame that threw warm light across our little camp. We cooked dinner on our camp stoves, simple fare of instant noodles and canned soup, and settled in around the fire as darkness fell. That's when the whispering started. At first, I thought it was just the wind in the trees. A soft susurrus that seemed to come from all directions at once, barely audible over the crackle of burning wood. But as the night deepened and the fire died down to glowing coals, the sound became more distinct. Not wind, voices. "Do you guys hear that?" Amanda asked quietly. We all went silent, listening. The whispering was definitely there. Multiple voices speaking in what might have been words, though I couldn't make out any actual language. It seemed to circle the clearing, moving from tree to tree, never quite close enough to understand, but always just on the edge of a comprehension. "It's just the wind," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Wind doesn't sound like that," Sarah replied. "Those are voices." The whispering continued for maybe 10 minutes, sometimes fading to almost nothing, sometimes growing loud enough that I was sure I was about to understand what they were saying. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We sat in silence for a long moment, each of us straining to hear something that was no longer there. "Maybe it was other campers," Amanda suggested hopefully. "Sound travels weird in the forest." "Other campers 3 miles from the nearest road?" I asked, speaking a language none of us recognized. Michael poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks. "Look, I know this is all a little strange, but there are rational explanations for everything we've experienced today. Getting turned around in the woods, acoustic tricks, even the compass thing, none of it is supernatural." But even as he spoke, I could see doubt creeping into his expression. The confident wilderness guide who had planned this trip was being replaced by someone who was trying very hard to convince himself that everything was normal. We decided to turn in early, though none of us was particularly tired. Sarah and Amanda zipped themselves into their shared tent, and I could hear them talking in low voices through the nylon walls. Michael and I had brought separate tents. Our relationship wasn't quite at the stage where we were ready to spend 3 days in forest proximity, so I settled into my sleeping bag alone. Sleep should have come easily after the long hike, but instead I lay awake listening to the forest. The absolute silence had returned, broken only by the occasional pop of settling wood in the fire ring. No night birds, no insects, no small animals moving through the underbrush. Just silence so complete it seemed to have weight. I must have dozed eventually, because I was awakened by the sound of my tent zipper being slowly opened. My eyes snapped open in the darkness, heart already racing. The zipper continued its quiet descent. Someone was definitely opening my tent from the outside, moving with deliberate stealth. Through the thin nylon, I could see the vague outline of a human figure silhouetted against the dying embers of our fire. "Michael?" I whispered. The figure froze for a moment, then continued working the zipper. It reached the bottom, and the tent flap fell open, revealing a shape that was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles. I scrambled backwards in my sleeping bag, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was outside my tent. The thing, because I was now certain it wasn't human, leaned forward and I caught a glimpse of what might have been a face. Pale skin stretched too tight over sharp bones, eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's, and a mouth that was open just slightly too wide. "Jennifer," it whispered, and the voice was Michael's voice, but wrong. Like someone doing a bad impression of him, getting the tone almost right but missing some essential quality that made it human. I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could make a sound, the thing that looked like Michael straightened up and walked away, moving with a strange, gliding gait that didn't quite look like walking. I lay there in my sleeping bag, shaking, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Eventually, I worked up the courage to poke my head out of the tent and look around the clearing. The fire had died to barely glowing coals. The other tents were dark and silent. There was no sign of the thing that had opened my tent, and no indication that anything unusual had happened. "Michael?" I called softly. His tent rustled, and I heard the sound of a zipper. A moment later, his head appeared in the opening of his tent. "Jen, what's wrong?" It was his voice, his face, everything normal and familiar, but I found myself studying his features in the dim light, looking for some sign that this wasn't really him. Were you just at my tent?" "No, I've been asleep. What happened?" I almost told him. The words were right there, ready to spill out. Someone or something had opened my tent, had whispered my name in a voice that sounded like his but wasn't. But looking at his concerned expression, his perfectly normal human confusion, I couldn't bring myself to say it. "Nothing," I said finally. "Bad dream, I guess. Sorry for waking you." He looked like he wanted to ask more questions, but I retreated into my tent and zipped it closed before he could respond. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening for any sound that might indicate something was moving around our camp. Morning came gray and overcast, with a mist that seemed to rise from the ground itself. I emerged from my tent feeling exhausted and on edge, jumping at every small sound. The others were already up, making coffee and breakfast on their camp stoves. "You look like hell," Sarah observed with characteristic bluntness. "Didn't sleep well," I admitted, accepting a cup of instant coffee that tasted better than it had any right to. "Yeah, this place has a weird vibe," Amanda agreed. "I kept having the strangest dreams." "What kind of dreams?" I asked, perhaps too quickly. She frowned, clearly trying to remember. People walking around outside our tent, voices calling my name, probably just anxiety about being somewhere so remote. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Did you see who was calling your name?" "It's hard to remember. Dreams, you know. But I think," she glanced at Sarah, "I think it was you, honey. But something was off about it. Like you were trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't understand what." Sarah shook her head. "I slept like the dead. No dreams at all." Michael was packing and repacking his gear with nervous energy, checking and rechecking items that were already perfectly organized. "I was thinking," he said without looking up, "maybe we should head back today instead of staying another night." "I thought you wanted to disconnect from civilization," I said. I did, but..." He gestured vaguely at the forest around us. "Something about this place just feels off. And my GPS is still acting up. I can't get a reliable reading on anything." None of us argued with him. Whatever had drawn us to this remote clearing, the magic was definitely gone. We broke camp efficiently, loading our packs and dousing the fire with water from the creek. The warm water hissed and steamed when it hit the coals, sending up a cloud of vapor that smelled faintly of sulfur. The hike back should have been straightforward. Retrace our steps along the logging road until we reached Michael's truck. But within the first mile, it became clear that something was wrong. The trail we were following didn't match the one we'd hiked in on. The ruts were in different places. The curve of the path felt wrong, and the trees alongside it seemed different somehow. More gnarled, more twisted, with bark that was darker and more deeply furrowed. "Are we on the right trail?" Amanda asked after we'd been walking for about 30 minutes. Michael stopped and checked his GPS, which was still spinning wildly. "This has to be the right trail. We didn't make any turns when we left the clearing." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his expression. The path we were on felt wrong in ways that went beyond simple directional confusion. The air was thicker here, harder to breathe, and there was a smell like rotting vegetation that seemed to follow us no matter how far we walked. "Maybe we should try the other direction," Sarah suggested. "Go back to the clearing and look for a different trail." The idea of going back to that place made my skin crawl, but it seemed like our only option. We turned around and retraced our steps, but after walking for what should have been long enough to reach the clearing, we found ourselves standing at the edge of a different meadow entirely. This one was smaller than our camping spot, roughly circular but choked with dead grass and fallen logs. There was no creek, no fire ring, and the trees surrounding it were all wrong, stunted and blackened as if they'd been burned, though there was no smell of smoke. "This isn't right," Michael said, and for the first time his voice carried a note of genuine panic. "This isn't where we came from." We spent the next 2 hours trying to find our way back to either the clearing where we'd camped or the trailhead where we'd left the truck. Every path we tried led to someplace different. Another meadow, a swampy area thick with standing water, a grove of trees that were all growing at wrong angles, as if gravity pulled in a different direction there. It was Amanda who first suggested that we might be dealing with something other than simple navigational confusion. "What if we're not lost?" she said as we stood at the edge of yet another unfamiliar clearing. "What if the forest is changing?" "That's ridiculous," Michael said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Is it?" Sarah asked. "Look around. We've been hiking for hours, and according to your GPS, we've covered maybe half a mile. Either the device is completely broken, or distance doesn't work the same way here." I thought about the thing that had visited my tent the night before, the whispered voices we'd heard around the fire, the too-perfect clearing where we'd made camp. Maybe Amanda was right. Maybe we weren't dealing with a navigation problem at all. That's when we heard the screaming. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, a sound of absolute terror and agony that made every hair on my body stand up. Human screaming, but with an edge of something that didn't quite sound right. Too long, too sustained, as if whoever was making it didn't need to breathe. The screaming went on for maybe 30 seconds, then cut off abruptly, leaving us standing in silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped. "What the hell was that?" Amanda whispered. Before anyone could answer, we heard it again. But this time, it was coming from a different direction, and this time, I recognized the voice. It was Michael's voice, screaming in agony somewhere off to our left, but Michael was standing right next to me. We all turned to look at him, and I watched the color drain from his face as he realized what we were hearing. His own voice, screaming as if he were being tortured to death, echoing through the forest from multiple directions at once. "That's not me," he said, and his real voice was small and scared. "That's not me. That's not me. That's not—" The screaming started again, and this time it was Amanda's voice. Then Sarah's. Then mine. Our own voices, crying out in pain and terror, calling for help from the darkness between the trees. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her nurse's training kicking in even as her voice shook with fear. "Right now. Pick a direction and run." But before we could move, something emerged from the tree line. It looked like Michael. Exactly like Michael, down to the clothes he was wearing and the expression of concern on his face. But it was wrong in the same way the thing at my tent had been wrong. Too tall, too thin, with joints that seemed to bend in directions that shouldn't be possible. "Hey guys," it said in Michael's voice. "I found the trail. Come on, this way." The real Michael took a step backward, staring at his doppelganger with undisguised horror. "What are you?" The thing that looked like him smiled, and the expression was all wrong. Too wide, showing too many teeth that were just slightly too sharp. "I'm you," it said reasonably. "I'm Michael Thompson, 31 years old, wilderness guide and biology teacher. Come on, Jen, you know me." It turned to look at me, and when our eyes met, I felt something cold and oily slither through my mind. For just a moment, I found myself wondering if maybe this was the real Michael, and the one standing next to me was the imposter. The thought felt foreign, invasive, like someone else's idea being forced into my head. "Don't listen to it," the real Michael said urgently. "Whatever it is, don't listen." But even as he spoke, more figures were emerging from the forest. Another Michael, then a version of myself, then Sarah and Amanda. Soon, we were facing perfect duplicates of ourselves, all smiling that too wide smile, all watching us with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "We're lost," said the thing that looked like me. "We've been wandering in circles for hours, but we found the way out. We can show you." "All you have to do is come with us," added the fake Sarah. "Trust us. We're your friends." I could feel that same cold, invasive pressure in my mind, stronger now, trying to convince me that these things were telling the truth, that they really were our friends, our loved ones, people we could trust. But there was something fundamentally wrong about them, something that made every instinct I had scream warnings. "Run," I whispered. "What?" asked the real Michael. "Run!" We bolted into the forest, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and the things that wore our faces. Behind us, I could hear laughter. Our own laughter, but wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. The forest seemed to shift and change around us as we ran. Trees moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. Paths appeared and disappeared, and the very ground seemed to tilt and sway like the deck of a ship. We stayed together through sheer determination, grabbing onto each other whenever the terrain tried to separate us. I don't know how long we ran. Time felt fluid, unreliable. The sun was overhead when we started, but now it seemed to be coming from different directions simultaneously, casting multiple shadows that moved independently of our bodies. Finally, exhausted and gasping, we stumbled into another clearing. This one was different from any we'd seen before, perfectly circular with short grass that looked like it had been cut with scissors and a ring of standing stones around the perimeter. Not rough field stones like the fire ring at our campsite, but carved monoliths covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. "What is this place?" Amanda panted. "I don't know," Michael admitted. "This wasn't on any of my maps." Sarah was examining the nearest stone, careful not to touch it. "These symbols, they're not any language I recognize, but they're definitely carved, not natural formations." I was more concerned with the fact that we seemed to be completely alone. No sounds of pursuit, no sign of the things that had been mimicking us, just silence and the oppressive feeling that we were being watched by unseen eyes. "We need to keep moving," I said. "Find a way out of here." But as we approached the far edge of the clearing, something made me stop. A sound, barely audible, like whispered conversation. I looked back and realized the stones weren't just carved with symbols. There were faces embedded in them. Human faces with expressions of terror and despair, mouths open as if they were trying to scream. And they were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving. The eyes tracked our progress across the clearing, and the mouths opened and closed as if they were trying to speak. "Guys," I said quietly, "look at the stones." We all turned back, and I watched the blood drain from everyone's faces as they saw what I was seeing. The faces in the stones were becoming more distinct, more recognizable, because they were us. Our own faces, trapped in rock, silently screaming for help that would never come. "This is where it wants us," Sarah said with sudden understanding. "This is what it does. It makes copies of people and then—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. We all understood. The things that had been chasing us weren't just mimics. They were replacements. And somewhere in this forest, maybe in this very clearing, the real versions of countless other people were trapped forever. "We're getting out of here," Michael said with desperate determination. "Right now. All of us." But even as he spoke, the familiar figures emerged from the tree line around the clearing. Our duplicates, still wearing those too wide smiles, still moving with that wrong, gliding gait. "Why are you running from yourselves?" asked the thing that looked like me. "We're trying to help you." "You've been walking in circles for hours," added the fake Michael. "You're tired, confused, scared. Let us take care of you." The pressure in my mind was back, stronger than ever, trying to convince me that surrender was the logical choice. We were lost, exhausted, completely out of our depth. What harm could there be in accepting help from ourselves? But then I looked at the faces in the stones again, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of them was moving its lips, not in a scream, but in words. A message, repeated over and over. Run, run, run. The stones, I whispered to the others. They're warning us. The duplicates were getting closer, circling the clearing like predators. But they stayed outside the ring of stones, I noticed. Whatever power kept the faces trapped in rock, it also seemed to limit where our mimics could go. We can't stay here, Amanda said, but we can't go out there either. That's when Sarah did something that probably saved all our lives. She picked up a loose rock from the ground and threw it at the nearest standing stone. The result was immediate and horrifying. The fake Sarah let out a shriek of pain and clutched at her head as if she'd been struck by the rock instead of the stone. The connection was clear. The trapped faces weren't just recordings or memories. They were tethers, links between the originals and their mimics. If we destroy the stones, Sarah said with dawning realization, we might be able to break whatever hold this place has on us. The duplicates must have understood what she was planning, because they all started moving at once, converging on our position with inhuman speed. But they still couldn't cross the ring of stones, which bought us precious seconds. "Everybody grab rocks," Michael shouted. "Aim for the faces." We scattered around the clearing, each of us taking a different stone. The trapped faces seemed to understand what we were planning. I could see relief in their expressions, as if they'd been waiting years for someone to set them free. I raised my rock and brought it down hard on the face that looked like me. The stone cracked with a sound like breaking bones, and the duplicate Jennifer screamed so loudly that birds I hadn't realized were there burst from the trees in panic. Around the clearing, the others were having similar success. Each blow to a stone sent the corresponding mimic into convulsions of pain, and with each crack in the rock, the trapped faces became fainter, more translucent. But our victory was short-lived. As the last stone shattered under Amanda's determined assault, the clearing began to change. The ground tilted and swayed. The trees spun like a slow whirlpool, and the very air seemed to thicken into something viscous and hard to breathe. "It's collapsing!" Michael yelled over a sound like the world's largest tree falling. "The whole place is coming apart!" Reality twisted around us, folding in on itself like origami made of space and time. I caught glimpses of other clearings, other forests, other groups of lost people facing their own duplicates. Layers of existence stacked on top of each other, all of them unraveling at once. And then, suddenly, we were standing on a familiar gravel road next to Michael's truck. The transition was so abrupt it took a moment for my brain to process what had happened. 1 second, we were in the middle of a supernatural nightmare. The next, we were back where we'd started, as if the entire weekend had been nothing more than a particularly vivid, shared hallucination. "What just happened?" Amanda asked, voicing what we were all thinking. Michael was checking his GPS device, which was now working perfectly and showing our exact location. "According to this, we never left. It says we've been standing here for..." He frowned at the screen. 3 minutes. But I knew that wasn't right. My legs ached from hiking. My clothes were torn from crashing through the underbrush, and when I checked my phone, I had dozens of missed calls and text messages from worried friends and family. Time had definitely passed, just not in any way that the normal world could measure. "Look," Sarah said quietly. She was pointing at the ground near our feet. In the soft dirt, clearly visible, were footprints. Not just ours, but duplicates. 2 sets of each person's tracks, leading from the truck toward the forest and then simply ending, as if the people who made them had stepped out of existence. We got in the truck and drove away without speaking. None of us wanted to discuss what had happened, maybe because putting it into words would make it real in a way that we weren't ready to accept. It was easier to tell ourselves that we'd gotten lost, panicked, maybe suffered some kind of shared stress reaction. But sometimes, late at night, I get text messages from myself, pictures of places I've never been, videos of me doing things I don't remember, and in every single one, the person who looks exactly like me is smiling just a little too wide, showing just a few too many teeth. I never responded to the messages. I never will, because deep in my bones, I know that somewhere in the Redden State Forest, in a clearing that exists outside of normal geography, something is still wearing my face, still trying to find a way to complete the replacement it started. And sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly paranoid, I catch myself in the mirror and wonder if I'm really me at all. If maybe I'm just another duplicate, walking around in the real Jennifer Williams life, slowly forgetting that I was ever anything else. The forest is still there. The paths still lead to places that shouldn't exist. And if you're ever hiking in Delaware and find yourself in a clearing with a ring of stones, whatever you do, don't look at the faces carved into them, because one of them might be yours. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote depths of Redden State Forest in Sussex County, Delaware, during what should have been a simple weekend camping trip that turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. Chris and I had been planning this trip for months. Christopher Hernandez, my best friend since college, had been going through a rough divorce and needed to get away from everything. As a software engineer, I'd been burning myself out with 80-hour weeks, and we both desperately needed to disconnect from the digital world. Redden State Forest seemed perfect. Over 14,000 acres of wilderness, miles from any cell towers with primitive camping sites that promised the kind of isolation we craved. Just you, me, and nature, brother, Chris had said when we loaded up my Jeep that Friday afternoon in October. No phones, no internet, no ex-wives trying to take half your shit. Chris was naturally optimistic, the kind of guy who could find the silver lining in a funeral. At 31, he'd maintained the easy smile and infectious laugh that had made him popular in college, though the recent stress had added lines around his eyes and a nervous energy to his movements. He'd grown a beard since the separation, patchy and unkempt, that made him look older than his years. We drove south from Wilmington as the autumn sun began its descent, painting the Delaware countryside in shades of gold and crimson. The familiar suburbs gradually gave way to farmland, then to the dense pine forests of Sussex County. The air grew thicker, heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and something else, something earthier, more primal. "You sure you know where you're going?" Chris asked as we turned off Route 404 onto increasingly narrow back roads. The GPS on my phone had lost signal 20 minutes ago. "Trust me," I said, though I was starting to have my own doubts. The paper map from the Delaware Forest Service showed our destination as a remote camping area called Deadman's Hollow, a name that had seemed darkly amusing when I'd made the reservation. Now, surrounded by towering loblolly pines that seemed to press closer to the road with each mile, it felt less like a joke. The sun was nearly gone when we finally found the turnoff, a barely visible dirt track marked only by a weather-beaten sign. Primitive camping area, 7, mile 3.2. The Jeep lurched and bounced over roots and rocks as we navigated the winding trail deeper into the forest. Branches scraped against the windows with sounds like fingernails on glass. "Jesus, Mike, this place is really out there," Chris muttered, peering into the gathering darkness between the trees. "When's the last time anyone maintained this road?" "That's the point," I replied, though I had to grip the steering wheel tighter as we hit another bone-jarring pothole. Complete isolation, no other campers, no noise pollution, just us and the wilderness. We almost missed the small wooden marker indicating our campsite. I backed the Jeep into a small clearing barely large enough for our tent, the headlights briefly illuminating a rough fire ring made of blackened stones and the skeletal remains of trees that seemed to lean inward like gnarled fingers. The moment I turned off the engine, the silence hit us like a physical force. "Damn," Chris whispered. "When was the last time you heard quiet like this?" He was right. There were no distant highway sounds, no planes overhead, no hum of civilization. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the forest was holding its breath. The only sounds were the faint settling noises of the cooling engine and our own breathing. We worked by flashlight to set up camp, our voices unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. The tent went up easily enough, a sturdy four-season model I'd bought for a Colorado trip that never happened. Chris gathered firewood while I unpacked our gear, but something felt wrong about the deadfall he collected. The wood was damp despite the dry weather, and much of it had an oily, unpleasant smell that made my stomach turn. "This stuff's all rotted," Chris said, dropping an armload of branches. "Look at this. It's like everything's been decaying for years." He was right. Even the recently fallen branches were soft and spongy, covered in a black mold that seemed to move in the shifting light of our flashlights. But we needed a fire, so we made do with what we could find, building a modest blaze that produced more smoke than heat and filled the air with an acrid, chemical stench. "Well, this is atmospheric," Chris said with forced cheerfulness, settling into one of our camp chairs. "Very Friday the 13th meets Deliverance." I laughed, but it came out strained. Something about this place was putting me on edge. Maybe it was the complete absence of wildlife sounds. No insects. No night birds. Nothing. Or maybe it was the way our fire seemed smaller than it should, its light barely penetrating a few feet into the surrounding darkness. We tried to maintain our normal camping routine, cooking hot dogs over the struggling fire and sharing a couple of beers, but conversation felt forced. The darkness beyond our small circle of light seemed impossibly dense, as if it were a living thing pressing against us. Several times I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd heard movement in the trees. "You hear that?" Chris asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, a half-eaten hot dog suspended halfway to my mouth. "Hear what?" Sounded like, I don't know, footsteps? Something moving around out there. We sat in absolute silence for several minutes, straining to hear over the pop and hiss of our fire. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched had settled over me like a cold blanket, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the warm October evening. "Probably just a deer," I said finally, though I didn't believe it. Deer would have made more noise crashing through the underbrush. Whatever I'd sensed moving out there had been careful, deliberate. "Yeah, probably," Chris agreed, but his hand moved unconsciously to the hunting knife on his belt. We stayed by the fire later than planned, neither of us willing to acknowledge that we were reluctant to go to sleep. The flames had turned an odd blue-green color, casting sickly shadows that seemed to move independently of the flickering light. The smell from the burning wood had grown worse, taking on a sweet, rotten undertone that reminded me of roadkill. "Mike," Chris said around midnight, his voice tight with unease, "I think we should pack up and leave." "Leave?" I turned to look at him. In the weird light from our fire, his face looked gaunt and pale, his eyes reflecting the flames like an animal's. "We just got here. It's the middle of the night." "I know how it sounds, but something's not right about this place. Can't you feel it?" He gestured toward the darkness surrounding us. "It's like the whole forest is sick or something, and that smell." He was right about the smell. What had started as the unpleasant odor of burning rotten wood had evolved into something far worse. A cloying, organic stench that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was getting stronger, and underneath it, I could swear I detected something else. Something that smelled like meat left too long in the sun. "Look, I get it," I said, trying to sound reasonable despite the unease crawling up my spine. "It's creepy out here, but we're not driving those back roads in the dark. We'd probably end up wrapped around a tree." Chris nodded reluctantly, but I could see he wasn't happy about it. "Fine, but first thing in the morning, we're out of here." We let the fire die down and crawled into our tent around 1 a.m., but sleep was elusive. The silence that had seemed so complete earlier was now broken by subtle sounds that might have been wind in the trees, or might have been something else entirely. Soft, scraping noises, like claws on bark. Wet, sliding sounds that made me think of something large moving through mud. I was finally drifting off when Chris grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "Mike!" he hissed. "Something's out there." I came fully awake instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the thin nylon of our tent, I could hear it too, footsteps circling our campsite. But they weren't the measured pace of a person or the irregular gait of an animal. These steps had a strange lurching quality, as if whatever was making them was having trouble walking. The steps stopped directly outside our tent. Through the fabric, I could see a shadow against the weak starlight, tall and impossibly thin, swaying slightly as if it were drunk or injured. We lay frozen, barely breathing, as something sniffed loudly just inches from our heads. The smell that had been plaguing us all evening suddenly intensified tenfold, pouring into our tent like a physical presence. It was the stench of death and decay, of meat left to rot in summer heat, of something fundamentally wrong with the natural order. Chris made a small gagging sound and pressed his face into his sleeping bag. Then, in a voice like wind through dry leaves, something spoke. "So, hungry." The words were barely recognizable as human speech, more like the dying breath of a tuberculosis patient than actual communication. But the intelligence behind them was unmistakable and utterly alien. Chris was hyperventilating now, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps that I was sure the thing outside could hear. I clamped my hand over his mouth and pressed my lips to his ear. "Don't move," I breathed. "Don't make a sound." The shadow outside our tent began to move again, but now I could see it more clearly. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, but emaciated to the point where it barely looked human. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at impossible angles. As it moved around our tent, I caught glimpses of yellowed bone showing through tears in its skin, of fingers that ended in blackened claws, of a face that was little more than a skull wrapped in rotting flesh. "So, hungry," it said again, and this time I could hear the wet sound of its mouth working as if it were salivating. The thing completed another circuit of our tent, then stopped again at the entrance. I heard the slow rasp of the zipper being pulled down, and cool night air rushed in, carrying with it a wave of that horrific stench. Chris whimpered into my palm, his entire body shaking with terror. Through the partially opened tent flap, I could see a pale, skeletal hand reaching toward us, its fingers ending in claws that had been sharpened to razor points. That's when my survival instincts finally kicked in. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on, directing the beam straight at the thing's face. What I saw in that brief moment of illumination will haunt me for the rest of my life. It had once been human, I could tell that much from its basic shape, but something had transformed it into a nightmare. Its skin hung in gray, putrid tatters from a frame that was nothing but bone and gristle. Its eyes were gone, replaced by deep black sockets that seemed to absorb light. Its mouth was a gaping wound filled with teeth that had been filed to points, and from its throat came a sound like steam escaping from a broken radiator. The creature recoiled from the light with a shriek that sounded like metal being torn in half. It stumbled backward into the darkness, crashing through the underbrush with inhuman strength. But even as it retreated, I could hear it calling out in that horrible, wheezing voice. "So hungry. So hungry." Jesus Christ. Chris was sitting up now, his sleeping bag clutched around him like armor. "What the fuck was that thing?" "I don't know," I said, my own voice shaking. "But we're getting out of here. Right now." We threw our gear into bags with trembling hands, not bothering to fold or organize anything. The creature had gone quiet, but I could feel it watching us from the darkness, waiting. My hands shook so badly I could barely work the tent stakes loose from the hard ground. "It's still out there," Chris whispered, his eyes darting between the trees. "I can smell it." He was right. The stench of decay hung in the air like fog, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As we loaded the Jeep, I kept sweeping the flashlight beam in wide arcs, expecting to see those hollow black sockets staring back at me. The engine turned over on the first try, and I'd never been so grateful to hear the rumble of an internal combustion engine. I threw the Jeep into reverse and backed out of the campsite as fast as I dared, the headlights cutting through the darkness between the trees. That's when I saw them. There were more of them, at least half a dozen, standing just at the edge of our headlight beams. They had the same emaciated horror movie appearance as the first one, but each was different. Different stages of decay, different levels of clothing hanging from their skeletal frames. Some still had wisps of hair clinging to their skulls, others were completely bald. But they all had those same empty eye sockets, and they were all watching us with an hunger that was palpable. "Oh, God," Chris moaned. "Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God." I spun the wheel and hit the gas, tires spinning in the soft dirt as we fled down the narrow trail. In the rearview mirror, I could see the creatures following us, not running but moving with that same lurching, unnatural gait. They were impossibly fast, keeping pace with the Jeep even as I pushed it to dangerous speeds on the rutted trail. "They're following us!" Chris shouted, looking back through the rear window. "They're actually keeping up!" Branches whipped past the windows as we bounced and careened down the trail. I took turns at speeds that should have rolled us, the Jeep's tires sliding on the loose earth. Behind us, I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, their inhuman voices calling out in that horrible, hungry chorus. So hungry, so hungry, so hungry. The trail seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the dark forest. Every time I thought we were making distance, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the mirrors, pale shapes flitting between the trees, keeping pace with mechanical persistence. "There," Chris pointed ahead, "the main road." I could see the break in the trees that marked the junction with the gravel road we'd taken to reach the campsite. I floored the accelerator for the final 100 yards, the engine screaming as we burst out of the forest and onto the wider path. The creatures stopped at the tree line. I could see them in the rearview mirror, a cluster of pale skeletal forms standing just inside the shadows of the forest. They swayed and writhed like plants in a breeze, but they didn't follow us onto the open road. "Why did they stop?" Chris asked, his voice still tight with terror. "I don't know," I said, but I wasn't slowing down. We raced through the darkness, putting miles between us and whatever nightmare we'd stumbled into. It wasn't until we hit Route 404 and saw the blessed glow of streetlights that I finally allowed myself to relax. We drove straight through to Wilmington without stopping, arriving at my apartment as the sun was coming up. Neither of us had spoken much during the drive. What was there to say? We'd encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged every rational assumption about the world. "We should call someone," Chris said as we sat in my living room, still in our dirty camping clothes. "The Forest Service, the police, somebody." "And tell them what?" I asked. "That we were attacked by zombies? They'd think we were on drugs or having some kind of shared psychotic break." Chris rubbed his face with both hands. "So, we just don't tell anyone? Pretend it didn't happen? What choice do we have?" But I couldn't just pretend it didn't happen. Over the next few days, I found myself researching everything I could about Redden State Forest and Sussex County folklore. That's when I discovered references to something called the Mhuwe, creatures from Delaware's Native American legends that were described as cannibalistic giants driven by insatiable hunger. According to the old stories, the Mhuwe were once human, but had been transformed by consuming human flesh during times of extreme starvation. They were said to inhabit the deepest parts of the forest, coming out only to hunt for more victims to satisfy their endless hunger. The descriptions matched what we'd seen with terrifying accuracy. Emaciated humanoid forms, incredible speed and strength, and an overwhelming stench of decay. The folklore suggested that the Mui were bound to specific locations, unable to leave the dark places where they'd been transformed. That would explain why they'd stopped at the tree line, why they hadn't followed us onto the main road. "You think that's what they were?" Chris asked when I shared my research. "These Mhu things?" "I don't know what else they could have been," I said, "but there's something else. I found records of missing persons in that area going back decades. Hikers, hunters, campers, people who went into Redden State Forest and never came out. Chris was quiet for a long moment. "You think they're still out there?" "Yeah," I said. "I think they're still out there, waiting." That was 3 months ago. Chris moved to California after his divorce was finalized, claiming he needed a fresh start, but I know the real reason. He couldn't handle being in Delaware anymore, couldn't handle the possibility that those things were still out there in the forest, less than 100 miles away. I've stayed, but I haven't been camping since. Every time I see a news report about missing hikers or hunters in Sussex County, I wonder if they wandered into the wrong part of the forest. I wonder if they met the Muhu. Sometimes, when the wind is from the south and carries the scent of pine and decay, I can almost smell that horrible stench again. And sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, I wake up convinced I can hear them calling across the miles. So hungry, so hungry, so hungry. The Delaware Forest Service lists Dead Man's Hollow as temporarily closed for habitat restoration. But I know the truth. They know something's wrong with that place, even if they don't understand what. The camping reservations for that area have been suspended indefinitely, and there are rumors that forest rangers won't patrol those trails alone anymore. I've thought about going back, about bringing proper equipment and maybe some backup. Part of me needs to know if they're still there, if what we experienced was real. But every time I start to make plans, I remember those empty eye sockets, that sound like tearing metal, the way they moved with predatory grace through the darkness. Some places are meant to stay hidden. Some hungers are better left unfed. The Mu are still out there in the deep places of Redden State Forest, waiting for the next group of campers who think they want to get away from civilization. They're patient. They've been patient for decades, maybe centuries, and they're always hungry. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Great Cypress Swamp of southern Delaware, in a place locals call Cypress Hollow, a stretch of ancient wetland where the trees grow so thick that noon feels like twilight, and where the silence between cricket songs can drive a man to madness. I should have listened to the warnings. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, just the four of us escaping the suffocating routine of our office jobs in Wilmington. Brandon Edwards, my college roommate and current co-worker at the insurance firm, had been pestering us for months about getting back to nature. Jessica Davis, our graphic designer and Brandon's on-and-off girlfriend, thought it sounded romantic and adventurous. Kevin King, our perpetually stressed accountant, needed the break more than any of us. His divorce had been finalized 3 weeks prior, and the dark circles under his eyes told the story of too many sleepless nights. "Trust me," Brandon had said, spreading a topographical map across his kitchen table the week before. "My uncle used to hunt down there in the 70s, said it was the most peaceful place on earth. No cell towers, no traffic, just pure wilderness." The irony of that statement would haunt me later. We drove down on a Friday afternoon in October, taking Route 9 through the flat coastal plains until we reached the dirt access road that led into the Nanticoke Wildlife Area. The further we drove from civilization, the more the landscape seemed to exhale an ancient, patient breath. Cypress trees rose like cathedral pillars from black water, their knees protruding from the swamp like the joints of buried giants. Spanish moss hung in gray curtains, and somewhere in the distance, something large splashed and went silent. "Jesus," Kevin muttered from the back seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the door handle. "Are we sure this is safe?" "Define safe," Jessica laughed, but her voice carried a nervous edge. She was filming everything with her phone for her Instagram stories, though I noticed she kept having to restart the videos. "The signal keeps cutting out. Is that normal?" "We're in the middle of nowhere," Brandon said, navigating around a pothole that could have swallowed a tire. "Of course there's no signal. That's the point." I was studying the GPS on my phone, watching as our little blue dot moved along roads that seemed to shift and blur on the screen. The device kept recalculating our route, insisting we make U-turns back toward highways that didn't exist on this map. Eventually, I gave up and folded the paper map Brandon had brought, tracing our path with my finger along the winding dirt roads. "There," Brandon said, pointing ahead to a small clearing beside a tributary of the Nanticoke River. "Perfect." The campsite wasn't marked on any official documentation, just a flat patch of slightly higher ground surrounded by ancient cypress and tupelo trees. The water here moved slowly, dark as coffee, reflecting the twisted branches above in perfect, unsettling symmetry. As we unloaded our gear, I noticed that the usual forest sounds, birds, insects, small mammals, seemed muted, as if the very air were holding its breath. Setting up camp took longer than expected. The ground, despite appearing solid, was spongy and unstable. Our tent stakes bent against what felt like solid earth but proved to be a thin crust over black mud that smelled of sulfur and decay. By the time we had our 2 tents secured and a fire ring established, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, turning the swamp into a maze of lengthening shadows. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Jessica asked as we sat around our struggling campfire. The wood, supposedly dry hardwood Brandon had purchased from a gas station 20 miles back, smoldered and hissed, producing more smoke than flame. Kevin nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. "It's like everything just stopped." He paused, listening. "Wait, do you hear that?" We all strained our ears. At first, there was nothing. Then, barely audible beneath the crackle of wet wood, came a sound like whispering. Not words, exactly, but something that resembled voices carried on a wind that didn't exist. "It's just the water moving through the trees," Brandon said, but his usual confidence seemed forced. "Sound travels weird in places like this." I wanted to believe him. We all did. But as darkness fell with the sudden finality that comes to low places surrounded by tall trees, the whispers grew more distinct. They seemed to circle our campsite, always just beyond the reach of our firelight, speaking in a language that felt familiar but remained frustratingly incomprehensible. That first night, none of us slept well. Our fire, despite multiple attempts to build it up, never rose above a sullen orange glow. The darkness pressed against us with almost physical weight, and every small sound, a branch falling somewhere in the distance, the splash of something moving through the water, the rustle of Spanish moss in air that felt perfectly still, sent adrenaline shooting through our systems. I was sharing a tent with Brandon, while Kevin and Jessica had the other. Around 3 in the morning, I was jerked awake by Brandon's hand on my shoulder. "Mike," he whispered, his voice tight with fear, "look outside." Through the mesh window of our tent, I could see Jessica standing at the edge of our campsite, perfectly still, facing the dark water. She was in her pajamas, barefoot, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. "What the hell is she doing?" I whispered back. "I don't know. She's been standing there for 10 minutes. We watched as Jessica took a step toward the water, then another. Her movements were smooth, purposeful, as if she were responding to some unheard instruction. "Jessica!" Brandon called out softly, not wanting to startle her but clearly alarmed. She didn't respond. Another step toward the water. "Jessica!" This time louder. She turned then, slowly, and even in the dim light of our dying fire, I could see her face. Her eyes were open but unfocused, distant, as if she were looking through us at something only she could see. For a long moment, she stared at our tent, and I felt ice water pour down my spine. There was something wrong with her expression, something vacant and hungry that didn't belong on Jessica's face. Then she blinked, shook her head, and looked around in confusion. "What? Why am I outside?" She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "God, it's freezing. Was I sleepwalking?" Brandon was out of the tent in seconds, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders. "You were walking toward the water. We called your name, but you didn't hear us." "I don't remember. She looked genuinely puzzled and genuinely frightened. I was dreaming about voices. They were calling me to come home. But this isn't home. This isn't anywhere I've ever been. Kevin emerged from their tent, groggy and irritated. What's all the noise about? Jessica was sleepwalking, Brandon explained. Almost walked right into the swamp. Kevin looked from Jessica to the dark water and back again. Well, that's not terrifying at all. Maybe we should set up some kind of alarm system or… I'm fine, Jessica insisted, but her voice shook. It was just a weird dream. Let's just go back to sleep. But none of us went back to sleep. We sat around the struggling fire until dawn, feeding it twigs and dry moss, none of us willing to admit that we were afraid to close our eyes. As the eastern sky began to lighten, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly, and the normal sounds of the swamp, frogs, birds, insects, gradually returned. You know what? Kevin said as we cooked breakfast over our reluctant fire. Maybe we should cut this short. Head back today. This place gives me the creeps. Oh, come on, Brandon protested, though he looked as tired and rattled as the rest of us. It's just one night. Jessica had a weird dream, that's all. We drove 3 hours to get here. Let's at least give it another day. I'm with Kevin, I said. Something feels off about this place. Jessica was quiet, stirring her instant oatmeal without eating it. Finally, she looked up. In my dream, she said slowly, there was something in the water, something that knew my name. It kept saying I belonged here, that I'd always belonged here. She paused. But the weird thing is, it felt true. When I was walking toward the water, it felt like I was finally going home. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. That's exactly why we should leave. But Brandon was stubborn, and Kevin, despite his nervousness, admitted he couldn't face going back to his empty apartment yet. Jessica seemed oddly detached from the conversation, staring out at the dark water with an expression I couldn't read. In the end, we agreed to stay one more night, with the understanding that if anything else strange happened, we'd pack up immediately. The day passed uneventfully. We explored the area around our campsite, took pictures of the impressive cypress trees, and tried to relax. The whispers we'd heard the night before seemed like products of overactive imaginations in the bright October sunlight. Kevin even managed to catch a small bass from the tributary, which we cooked for lunch and which tasted surprisingly good despite the sulfurous smell that seemed to permeate everything in the swamp. As evening approached, however, the oppressive atmosphere began to return. The shadows grew longer and darker, and the spaces between sounds stretched into uncomfortable silences. Our fire, built with the same reluctant wood as the night before, again refused to burn properly. I'll go get more wood, Kevin offered as the sun touched the horizon. Maybe if we can find some driftwood that's actually dry, we can get a decent fire going. Don't go alone, Jessica said quickly. Brandon, go with him. But Brandon was already setting up his camera to take time-lapse photos of the sunset. He'll be fine. Just stay close to camp, Kev. Don't go beyond shouting distance. Kevin grabbed a flashlight and headed into the trees. We watched his light bob through the Spanish moss until it disappeared around a massive cypress trunk. For about 10 minutes, we could hear him moving through the underbrush, the occasional crack of a branch being broken for firewood. Then the sounds stopped. Kevin, Brandon called. You find anything good? No response. Kevin! Still nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until even the normal evening sounds of the swamp seemed to fade away. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Jessica whispered. We should never have come here. Brandon stood up, grabbing his own flashlight. I'm going to find him. Maybe he fell or got turned around. We should all go, I said, but Brandon was already walking toward the tree line. Stay with Jessica. Keep the fire going. I'll bring him back. And then Brandon was gone too, his light disappearing into the maze of trees and water. Jessica and I sat by our pathetic fire, listening to the silence grow more complete with each passing minute. How long has it been? Jessica asked. I checked my watch, or tried to. The display was scrambled, showing impossible times, the numbers shifting even as I looked at them. I don't know, maybe 20 minutes? We should call for help. I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course, but something was wrong with the device itself. The screen flickered between apps I'd never seen before, and when I tried to access the camera, it showed images of the swamp taken from impossible angles, aerial views, underwater perspectives, photos of our campsite taken from inside the tree line while we slept. "Jessica," I said slowly, "something is very wrong here." She looked at my phone and went pale. "Those pictures, when were those taken?" Before I could answer, we heard Brandon's voice calling from the darkness. "Mike! Jessica! I found Kevin. He's hurt." Relief flooded through me. "Thank God," Jessica breathed. "Where are you?" I shouted back. "By the big cypress with the split trunk, about 100 yards northwest of camp. Bring the first aid kit." I grabbed our medical supplies and another flashlight, and Jessica and I hurried toward Brandon's voice. The beam of my light seemed weaker than it should have been, absorbed by the darkness rather than pushing it back. Spanish moss brushed against our faces like grasping fingers, and more than once I had the sensation that something was moving just outside our circle of illumination. We found them by the massive cypress Brandon had described. Kevin was sitting with his back against the tree, conscious but dazed. There was blood on his forehead and his left ankle was bent at an unnatural angle. "What happened?" Jessica asked, kneeling beside him. I'm not sure," Kevin said slowly. His voice sounded different, softer, more distant. "I was gathering wood, and I heard something calling my name. I followed the sound, and then I think I fell. Everything's kind of fuzzy." Brandon was pacing nearby, his flashlight beam dancing nervously through the trees. "He was unconscious when I found him. Must have tripped over a root or something in the dark." I knelt down to examine Kevin's ankle. It was definitely broken, the bone clearly displaced beneath the skin. "We need to get you to a hospital," I told him. "This is serious." Kevin nodded, but there was something odd about his expression. He was smiling, not broadly, but a small, satisfied smile that seemed completely inappropriate given the circumstances. And he kept staring past us into the darkness, as if he could see something we couldn't. "Can you walk if we help support you?" Brandon asked. "I think so," Kevin said, still with that strange smile. "I feel different. Better, actually. Like something that was broken has finally been fixed." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was something wrong with the way he was talking, with the tone of his voice. It was still Kevin's voice, but there was a cadence to it, an inflection that didn't belong. "Come on," I said. "Let's get back to camp and figure out how to get you out of here." We helped Kevin to his feet, supporting him between us as we made our way back through the trees. He was surprisingly light, and he moved with an odd, fluid grace despite his broken ankle. Every few steps he would pause and tilt his head as if listening to something, that small smile never leaving his face. Back at camp, we settled Kevin by the fire and tried to decide what to do next. Our cell phones were still malfunctioning, showing impossible times and strange images. The car keys were in Brandon's backpack, but even if we could get Kevin to the vehicle, the drive out of the swamp would be treacherous in the dark. We should wait until morning, Brandon decided. Try to stabilize his ankle, keep him warm and alert. At first light, we pack up and get him to a hospital. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said quietly, pulling Brandon aside. "Something's wrong with him. Look at the way he's staring at the fire." Kevin was indeed staring at the flames, but his expression wasn't the blank gaze of someone in shock. His eyes were sharp, alert, calculating, and every few minutes he would whisper something under his breath. Words I couldn't quite make out, but that sounded like they might be in another language entirely. "He has a head injury," Brandon whispered back. "People act weird after head trauma. He's probably confused." But as the night wore on, Kevin's behavior became increasingly disturbing. He refused food and water, claiming he wasn't hungry or thirsty. When Jessica tried to clean the blood from his forehead, he pulled away sharply, and for just a moment, his eyes flashed with something that looked like rage before the strange smile returned. Around midnight, he began to speak. "This place remembers everything," he said softly, his voice carrying an odd, sing-song quality. "Every person who ever walked here, every animal that died here, every secret that was buried in the black water. It all becomes part of the swamp, part of the hunger that lives beneath." "Kevin," Jessica said gently, "you're scaring me. You hit your head. You're not thinking clearly." Kevin turned to look at her, and I saw Jessica recoil slightly. His eyes were wrong. Not the color, which was still the familiar brown, but the expression behind them. Cold, ancient, utterly inhuman. "I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have," he said. "For the first time in my life, I understand what I am, what we all are." He gestured toward the dark water. Food. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air, and in the brief flare of light I could have sworn I saw something massive moving in the water behind Kevin. Something with too many joints and eyes that reflected the firelight like stars. "That's it," I said, standing up. "We're leaving. Now." "No," Kevin said, and his voice carried an authority that made all of us freeze. "No one leaves. No one ever leaves." He rose smoothly to his feet, putting no weight on his supposedly broken ankle. The bones I had clearly seen displaced beneath the skin were now perfectly aligned, and he moved with a predatory grace that was nothing like the Kevin I'd known for 3 years. "Kevin?" Brandon's voice was uncertain, frightened. "Kevin is still here," the thing wearing Kevin's face said. "He's just deeper now, sharing space with something much older, much hungrier. He wants you to know that he's sorry for what's about to happen, but he also wants you to know that it's better this way. Better than the divorce, better than the depression, better than the slow death of ordinary life." Jessica was backing toward the edge of camp, but Kevin, or whatever Kevin had become, moved to block her path with inhuman speed. "Where are you going, Jessica?" he asked with that terrible smile. "Don't you want to come home? You felt it last night, didn't you? The call of the water? The promise of belonging?" "Stay away from her," Brandon said, stepping between them. But Kevin simply reached out and backhanded him with casual strength that sent Brandon flying into a tree with a sickening crack. Brandon didn't get up. Jessica screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the swamp and seemed to wake something in the darkness around us. The water began to churn, and from its depths came an answering call, a sound like wind through a canyon, like the death rattle of something immense. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at Kevin, but he caught my wrist with fingers that felt like steel cables. Up close, I could see that his pupils had expanded to swallow most of the iris, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made him look like a corpse. "Michael," he said conversationally, "you were always the smart one. The one who asked questions, who noticed details. You've probably figured out by now that this isn't really Kevin anymore." "What are you?" I gasped, trying to pull free from his grip. "I'm what lives in the spaces between," he said, "in the dark water, in the deep mud, in the forgotten places where hungry things wait for fools to wander too far from safety. Your friend Kevin heard my voice and answered, and now I have his body, his memories, his face. But I'm still hungry, Michael. I'm always hungry." Behind him, Jessica was trying to reach Brandon, who lay motionless at the base of the cypress tree. I could see blood pooling beneath his head, black in the firelight. "Let her go," I said. "Take me instead." Kevin Thing laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Michael, you don't understand. I'm not here to make deals. I'm here to feed." He released my wrist only to grab me by the throat, lifting me off the ground with impossible strength. His fingers felt like ice, and where they touched my skin, I could feel something cold and alien trying to burrow its way inside. "Don't fight it," he whispered. Kevin didn't fight it. He welcomed me in. He wanted the pain to stop, and I stopped it for him. Permanently. The edges of my vision were starting to go dark when I heard Jessica scream again. But this time, it wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of rage. She had found a piece of broken branch, thick as a baseball bat, and she brought it down on Kevin's head with all her strength. The impact should have dropped him, but Kevin barely staggered. He turned to face her, his grip on my throat loosening just enough for me to breathe. "Jessica," he said with mock disappointment, "I had such plans for you. The water wants you so badly. Can't you feel it calling? But if you're going to be difficult—" He dropped me and lunged toward her with inhuman speed. Jessica swung the branch again, but Kevin caught it in one hand and snapped it like a twig. Then his hands were around her neck, and I could see the life starting to drain from her eyes. I don't know where the strength came from. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was rage, or maybe it was something else, some primal human instinct to fight against the unnatural. But I found myself launching my entire body at Kevin, driving him away from Jessica and sending both of us tumbling toward the fire. We rolled through the coals, scattering sparks and burning wood, and I felt the heat sear through my jacket. Kevin shrieked, not with Kevin's voice, but with something that sounded like tearing metal, and for a moment his inhuman strength seemed to falter. "Fire!" I shouted to Jessica. "It doesn't like fire!" I grabbed another burning branch and pressed it against Kevin's chest. His shirt caught flame, and the thing inside him writhed and screamed. For just an instant, I saw Kevin's real face break through, confused, terrified, and deeply grateful. "Mike," he whispered with his own voice, "kill me, please. It's so cold inside and I can't fight it much longer." Then the thing was back in control, and Kevin's face contorted with alien rage. He backhanded me again, sending me sprawling, and began to roll in the dirt to extinguish the flames. Jessica had managed to build up the fire, feeding it everything combustible she could find. The flames rose higher than they had since we'd arrived, casting wild shadows that danced through the trees. In that flickering light, I could see the thing in the water more clearly, something vast and segmented, and with too many eyes and appendages that moved like seaweed in an underwater current. "It's not just Kevin," I realized aloud. "There's something else, something in the water." Jessica followed my gaze and went pale. "Oh, God! Oh, God! What is that thing?" The creature in the water was rising, water cascading from its impossible form as it began to emerge onto land. It was like looking at a Wendigo crossed with something from the deep ocean. Elongated limbs that bent in too many places, a torso that seemed to shift and change shape as I watched, and a face that was a writhing mass of smaller faces, all of them hungry. Kevin stood up, his burns already healing with unnatural speed. "You can't fight us both," he said. "The fire won't burn forever, and when it dies, we'll take you into the water. We'll take you down to where the mud is soft and the darkness is complete, and you'll become part of us, part of the hunger." But as he spoke, I noticed something. The creature from the water had stopped its advance. It was staying just outside the circle of firelight, its many eyes fixed on the flames with what looked like fear. "The fire doesn't just hurt you," I said slowly. "It traps you. You can't cross it." Kevin's expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time. "Clever," he admitted, "but you can't stay by the fire forever. Eventually, you'll run out of fuel. Eventually, you'll have to sleep. And when you do—" "Maybe," I said. "But right now, you're the one who's trapped." I picked up another burning branch and advanced on Kevin. He backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The fire pit was behind him, and Jessica had built up a barrier of burning logs on either side. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, we had the advantage. "You know what I think?" I continued, driving Kevin back toward the main fire. "I think you need Kevin's body to exist on land, and I think Kevin's body can still be hurt by fire, even if you can heal it afterwards." "Michael, don't," Kevin began, but I was already moving. I shoved the burning branch directly into his chest, driving him backwards into the fire pit. Kevin, or the thing wearing his face, screamed as the flames engulfed him. But this time, the scream was definitely inhuman. The fire seemed to burn differently where it touched him, blue-white instead of orange, and cold instead of hot. The creature in the water let out an answering wail that shook the trees and sent every bird in the swamp into panicked flight. It began to retreat back into the deeper water, its form becoming less distinct as it sank beneath the surface. But Kevin wasn't finished. Even as the flames consumed his clothes and began to char his skin, he lunged toward Jessica with the last of his strength. His hands, now wreathed in blue fire, closed around her ankle. Jessica screamed as the cold fire spread up her leg, and I could see the same alien hunger beginning to fill her eyes. Whatever was in Kevin was trying to jump to a new host. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed the heaviest piece of burning wood I could find, a log as thick as my arm, and brought it down on Kevin's head with all my strength. There was a wet crack, and Kevin's body went limp. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and Jessica's ragged breathing. Then Kevin's body began to convulse, and something dark and viscous began to leak from his ears and mouth. The substance moved with purpose, flowing toward the water, but I was ready for it. I built a circle of fire around the dying creature using every piece of combustible material in our campsite. The thing writhed and hissed as the flames closed in, its form becoming more distinct as it was forced to solidify. It looked like a cross between a leech and an octopus, covered in tiny mouths filled with needle teeth. "Burn," I whispered and fed the fire until the creature was nothing but ash and the stench of sulfur. Kevin's body stopped moving. His eyes were open, but they were his own eyes again, brown, human, and very, very dead. Jessica was sitting by the fire staring at her ankle where Kevin had touched her. The skin was blackened and cold to the touch, and I could see veins of darkness spreading up her leg like infection. "Mike," she said quietly, "I can feel it. It's inside me now." I looked from Jessica to Brandon, who was still unconscious and bleeding from his head wound, to the dark water where other shapes were beginning to stir. We were trapped in a nightmare, and I had no idea how to wake up. "We have to get out of here," I said. "Can you walk?" Jessica tried to stand and immediately collapsed. The dark veins had spread to her hip, and her leg was completely numb. "I can't feel anything below my waist," she said. "And Mike, I can hear it whispering. The same voice that called to me last night, it's telling me to go to the water." "Fight it," I said desperately. "Don't listen." But even as I spoke, I could see the change beginning in her eyes. The same cold intelligence that had looked out through Kevin's face was starting to surface in Jessica's. I had maybe minutes before I lost her too. I managed to drag Brandon's unconscious form to the fire and check his pulse. He was alive, but barely. Blood was still seeping from a deep gash on the back of his head, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. Even if I could figure out a way to get him conscious, he was in no condition to walk out of here. Jessica, meanwhile, was staring at the water with increasing fascination. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Can you see them? All the people who came before us? They're all there, waiting in the deep places, waiting to welcome us home." "Jessica, look at me," I said sharply. "Remember who you are. Remember your life outside this place. Your job, your apartment, your family." She turned to face me, and for a moment, her eyes cleared. "Mike," she said in her normal voice, "what's happening to me? I feel so cold, and there are voices in my head that aren't mine." "Something got into you when Kevin grabbed your ankle," I explained. "The same thing that was controlling him. But you're still you, Jessica. You can fight it." "I don't know how much longer," she whispered. "It's getting stronger, and I'm getting so tired. Maybe it would be easier to just let go." "No," I said fiercely. "Don't give up. We're going to get out of here, all of us." But even as I said it, I knew it was probably a lie. Brandon needed immediate medical attention. Jessica was losing her battle against whatever had infected her, and I had no idea how to get us back to the car in the dark with creatures moving in the water around us. That's when I remembered something from the research I'd done before the trip. The old logging roads through this part of the swamp had been built on raised ground, following the natural ridges that stayed dry even during flood season. If I could find one of those roads, I might be able to get us to higher ground, away from the water and whatever lived in it. I pulled out the paper map, the only navigation tool that still seemed to be working properly. According to the topographical lines, there should be a logging road about half a mile northeast of our campsite, running roughly parallel to Route 9. "Jessica," I said, "I need you to help me with Brandon. We're going to try to reach the old logging road." She looked at me with eyes that were now more alien than human. "Why would I want to leave?" she asked with that terrible smile. "This is where I belong. This is where we all belong." The infection had taken hold too quickly. In a matter of minutes, Jessica had gone from fighting the influence to embracing it. I was losing her just like I'd lost Kevin. "Because the fire is dying," I said, pointing to our campfire, which had indeed burned lower while we talked. "And when it goes out, that thing in the water is going to come back. Do you really want to become food for something like that?" For just an instant, Jessica's real personality flickered back to the surface. "Help me," she whispered. "Please, Mike, I can feel myself disappearing." I made a decision that I'll regret for the rest of my life. I grabbed one of the smaller burning branches and pressed it against Jessica's infected ankle, hoping that fire might purge whatever was inside her the same way it had driven the creature from Kevin's body. Jessica screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the swamp, but the dark veins that had been spreading up her leg began to recede. The alien intelligence in her eyes flickered and dimmed. "Again," she gasped. "It's working. I can think clearly again, but it's trying to come back." I applied the fire again, this time to her thigh where the infection had spread. Jessica bit down on a piece of leather from her belt to keep from screaming, tears streaming down her face as the flames seared her flesh. But it worked. The darkness retreated further, and when I looked into her eyes, I saw only Jessica. Hurt, terrified, but human. "Can you walk?" I asked. She tested her weight gingerly. Her leg was badly burned, but she could stand. "I think so. What about Brandon?" I looked at my unconscious friend, calculating distances and obstacles. There was no way I could carry him half a mile through swamp terrain in the dark. Not with Jessica injured and creatures stalking us from the water. "We'll have to come back for him," I said, though I knew it was another lie. By the time we could return with help, if we even survived to reach help, Brandon would be long dead. I built up the fire around Brandon's unconscious form, creating a barrier that might protect him for a few hours. Then Jessica and I gathered what supplies we could carry and began our desperate trek toward the logging road. Moving through the swamp at night was like navigating a fever dream. The beam of my flashlight seemed to bend and twist, showing us paths that led nowhere and obstacles that vanished when we approached them. More than once, we heard things moving in the water beside us, large things that created wakes but never fully surfaced. Jessica's burns were slowing her down, and every few minutes she would stop and press her hands to her temples, fighting against whispers that only she could hear. "It's still there," she said during one of these pauses, waiting for me to get weak, waiting for a chance to take control again. "Mike, if I start acting strange, if I stop being me—" "You won't," I said. "We're going to make it out of here." But privately, I was beginning to doubt that either of us would survive the night. We'd been walking for what felt like hours when we finally found the logging road. It was overgrown and barely visible, but it was definitely there. A raised strip of ground that ran in a straight line through the swamp toward higher terrain. "Thank God," Jessica breathed, leaning against a tree. Her leg was bleeding through the makeshift bandages I'd applied, and her face was pale with pain and exhaustion. That's when we heard the scream from the direction of our campsite. Brandon was awake, and something had found him. The sound that reached us across the water was barely human, a mixture of agony, terror, and desperate pleading that cut through the night air like a blade. It went on for almost a full minute before ending abruptly in a wet, choking silence. Jessica began to cry. "We left him," she sobbed. "We left him to die." "He was already dying," I said, though the words felt like ash in my mouth. There was nothing we could do. But I knew I'd carry the sound of Brandon's final scream for the rest of my life, however long that might be. We continued along the logging road, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and whatever had killed our friend. With every step, the oppressive atmosphere of the deep swamp began to lighten slightly. The whispers that had been following us grew fainter, and Jessica reported that the alien voice in her head was becoming less insistent. Dawn was breaking by the time we reached the main road. The normal world of asphalt and power lines and cell phone towers felt like a miracle after the primordial nightmare we'd escaped. My phone, which had been malfunctioning for 2 days, suddenly sprang back to life with a dozen missed calls and text messages. I called 911 and reported that there had been an accident in the swamp, that 2 of our friends were dead, and that we needed immediate medical attention for burns and exposure. The paramedics who responded were professional and competent, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes when Jessica and I tried to explain what had really happened. The search and rescue team that went looking for Kevin and Brandon found our campsite easily enough. They found Brandon's body, or what was left of it, scattered around the cold remains of our fire. The official report stated that he had been mauled by an unknown animal, possibly an alligator that had wandered up from the coastal areas. They never found Kevin's body at all. The fire pit where I'd killed him contained only normal ash and the melted remains of camping equipment. It was as if he had simply vanished. Jessica and I spent 3 days in the hospital, being treated for burns, exposure, and what the doctors politely termed psychological trauma related to the wilderness incident. Neither of us tried very hard to convince them of what had really happened. Who would believe such a story? But the infection in Jessica's leg never fully healed. Despite multiple surgeries and treatments, the area where Kevin had grabbed her remained numb and discolored. Worse, she continued to hear whispers, faint but persistent, calling her to return to the dark water of Cypress Hollow. 6 months after our ordeal, Jessica drove back to Delaware alone. She was found 3 days later, floating face down in the exact spot where our campsite had been. The autopsy showed that she had drowned, but there was no water in her lungs. The coroner classified it as death by unknown causes. I was the only survivor, the only one left to tell this story. And sometimes, late at night when the darkness presses close around my apartment in Wilmington, I can hear them too, the whispers from the deep places, calling me to come home to the swamp where hungry things wait beneath black water. I've moved 3 times since then, always farther from Delaware, always toward brighter lights and busier streets. But distance doesn't seem to matter. The voices follow me wherever I go, patient and persistent, reminding me that some hungers are older than human civilization, and that there are places in this world where ancient things still hold dominion over the darkness. I don't sleep well anymore. I keep every light in my apartment burning from sunset to sunrise, and I've never been camping since. But I know that eventually, the voices will grow too strong to resist. Eventually, I'll find myself driving south on Route 9, drawn back to Cypress Hollow where the cypress trees rise like cathedral pillars from water black as sin. When that day comes, I won't fight it. I've seen what happens to those who fight the call of the deep places. It's better to go willingly, to walk into the dark water with open eyes and an understanding heart. Better to feed the hunger than to run from it forever. After all, we all have to come home eventually. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote woodlands near Redden State Forest in southern Delaware, in a place where the pine barrens stretch endlessly and cell towers are just a distant memory. It was supposed to be a simple team-building weekend. 4 colleagues from our insurance office in Wilmington, finally taking up Jennifer's suggestion to disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with nature. The irony of those words still makes my hands shake when I write them. Jennifer Davis had been planning this trip for months, her enthusiasm infectious despite our initial reluctance. At 29, she was the outdoorsy type who kept protein bars in her desk drawer and hiking boots in her car trunk. She'd found this remote camping spot through some obscure hiking forum, a clearing deep in the state forest where you could see more stars than anywhere else on the East Coast. Robert Johnson, our 31-year-old data analyst, had grumbled about leaving his gaming setup for an entire weekend, but Sarah Lopez had finally convinced him. Sarah, 28 and always the peacemaker in our office disputes, thought it would be good for team morale. As the senior claims adjuster, I felt obligated to support anything that might improve our work dynamic. We met at the office Friday evening, loading our gear into Jennifer's SUV. The October air carried that sharp bite that promises winter, and the forecast called for clear skies but dropping temperatures. Jennifer had printed out detailed maps and directions. She never trusted GPS in remote areas, she said. Smart girl. The drive took us southeast through increasingly sparse communities, past Seaford, past Bridgeville, until we were following narrow county roads that seemed to exist only as suggestions carved through towering loblolly pines. Jennifer navigated by her printed maps, occasionally stopping to check road signs that were either missing or so weathered they were illegible. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Robert asked for the third time, his pale face glowing blue from his phone screen. "I lost signal about 20 miles back." "That's the point," Jennifer laughed, making another turn onto what looked more like a logging road than an actual street. "Digital detox, remember?" The road deteriorated into deep ruts and loose gravel. Pine boughs scraped against the windows, and more than once I thought we'd have to turn back. But Jennifer pressed on with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey before, though she'd assured us this was her first time visiting this particular spot. We finally stopped in a clearing that opened like a wound in the forest. Ancient pines formed a nearly perfect circle around a space just large enough for our 2 tents and a fire pit someone had constructed from local stones. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of pine needles that muffled our footsteps and gave the entire area an unsettling silence. "How did you even find this place?" Sarah asked, emerging from the car and stretching. The temperature had dropped significantly, and our breath formed small clouds in the air. Jennifer pulled out her phone to check the time, then laughed. "Dead battery. Good thing I brought my watch." She tapped the analog timepiece on her wrist. "It's almost 7. We should set up camp before we lose the light." That first evening passed uneventfully. We erected our tents, Jennifer and Sarah sharing one, Robert and I taking the other, and built a modest fire. Jennifer had brought ingredients for s'mores, and we spent a couple hours sharing office gossip and bad jokes. The darkness beyond our fire seemed absolute, pressing against us like a living thing, but we attributed that to being away from city lights. Robert kept checking his phone obsessively, even though he knew there was no signal. "It's weird," he muttered. "Usually you can pick up something, even in remote areas, but this thing is completely dead." "Mine too," Sarah confirmed. "But Jennifer's right. It's kind of liberating." I noticed Jennifer hadn't checked her phone since we'd arrived. When I mentioned it, she shrugged. "Died in the car. Forgot my charger." But something about her tone felt off, though I couldn't pinpoint why. We turned in around 11, exhausted from the drive and setup. The silence outside our tents was profound. No traffic noise, no electronic hum, not even the typical forest sounds you'd expect. Just an oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow our whispered goodnights. I woke sometime in the deep hours before dawn to the sound of footsteps circling our campsite. Slow, deliberate steps crunching through the pine needles in a steady rhythm. I lay perfectly still, listening, trying to determine if it was an animal or something else. The steps paused directly outside our tent, and I could hear breathing. Deep, measured breaths that definitely didn't belong to any wildlife I knew. "Robert," I whispered, but he was snoring softly beside me. The breathing outside continued for what felt like hours before finally moving away. I didn't sleep again until dawn. Saturday morning brought overcast skies and a chill that our fire couldn't quite chase away. I mentioned the nighttime visitor to the others, but they'd slept through it. Jennifer seemed particularly dismissive. "Probably just a deer," she said, though her eyes didn't meet mine. "They're curious about campers." We spent the day hiking the unmarked trails that wound through the surrounding forest. Jennifer led us confidently through terrain that all looked identical to me. Endless stands of pine broken occasionally by marshy clearings. She claimed to be following her compass, but I never saw her check it. The strange incidents began that afternoon. Sarah's backpack, which she'd left beside her tent, was found halfway across the clearing. "I know I put it right here," she insisted, but Jennifer suggested the wind might have caught it. There was no wind. Robert's sleeping bag was discovered unzipped and turned inside out, though he swore he'd left it properly arranged. "Maybe an animal got into it," Jennifer offered, but there were no tracks, no signs of disturbance in the pine needles around the tent. Most disturbing was when I found Jennifer's water bottle sitting in the center of our fire pit, somehow unmelted despite the coals still glowing beneath it. When I pointed it out, Jennifer stared at it for a long moment before claiming she must have dropped it there by accident. "But it should have melted," I insisted. "Plastic's funny sometimes," she said, but her voice carried a note I'd never heard before, something cold and distant. That evening, as we prepared dinner over our rebuilt fire, Sarah noticed something that made her voice catch in her throat. "Jennifer, where did you get those clothes?" I looked up from the can of beans I was opening. Jennifer was wearing the same jeans and flannel shirt she'd had on when we arrived, but something was different. The flannel looked newer somehow, the colors brighter, the fabric unworn. But more than that, it didn't quite fit her right. The sleeves were too long, the shoulders too broad. "What do you mean?" Jennifer asked, not looking up from her own food preparation. "That shirt, wasn't it blue yesterday? Now it looks green." Jennifer finally raised her head, and for just a moment, in the flickering firelight, her face looked wrong. The features were all Jennifer's, but the proportions seemed off, as if someone had tried to recreate her appearance from memory and gotten the details slightly incorrect. "It's the same shirt," Jennifer said, and her voice was Jennifer's voice, but the rhythm of her speech was different, slower, more deliberate. "You're seeing things in the firelight." But Sarah was right. The shirt was different. And now that I was looking closely, Jennifer's hair seemed darker, her skin paler. When she smiled, her teeth looked too large for her mouth. We ate our dinner in uncomfortable silence. Robert kept glancing at Jennifer with a worried expression, while Sarah had moved her camp chair noticeably farther from our friend. I found myself studying Jennifer's movements, noting how she held her fork differently, how she chewed her food with mechanical precision. "I think I'm going to gather some more firewood," Jennifer announced after we'd finished eating. "The temperature's supposed to drop tonight." She stood and walked toward the tree line, moving with a strange, gliding gait that didn't match Jennifer's usual energetic stride. We watched her disappear into the darkness beyond our fire's reach. "Something's wrong with her," Sarah whispered as soon as Jennifer was out of earshot. "What do you mean?" Robert asked, though his tone suggested he'd noticed it too. "She's different, the way she's been talking, moving, and those clothes." Sarah shuddered. "That's not the same shirt she was wearing yesterday. I know because I complimented her on it when we got here. It was definitely blue." I nodded slowly. "Her face looks different too. Subtly, but different." "You guys are freaking me out," Robert said, but he was scanning the tree line nervously. "She's probably just tired. This kind of isolation can affect people weirdly." 20 minutes passed, then 30. The pile of deadfall around our campsite was substantial. Jennifer should have returned with an armload of wood within 10 minutes. "Should we go look for her?" Sarah asked. Before any of us could answer, we heard footsteps approaching from the direction Jennifer had gone. Slow, measured steps that seemed to take too long between each footfall. A figure emerged from the darkness, carrying an armload of wood. It was Jennifer, but it wasn't. The proportions of her body were subtly wrong, as if someone had tried to stretch her image vertically. Her arms seemed longer, her torso too narrow. She walked to the fire and deposited the wood with mechanical precision, then sat in her camp chair without a word. "Find enough wood?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Jennifer turned to look at me, and her head moved too far, rotating almost 90 degrees before stopping. Her eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Yes," she said, and her voice was Jennifer's but wrong, too deep, too resonant, as if it was coming from somewhere else and being projected through her mouth. Robert stood up abruptly. "I'm going to use the bathroom," he announced, heading toward the tree line on the opposite side of camp from where Jennifer had gone. "Don't go alone," I called after him, but he waved me off. "Just going right over there. I'll be back in 2 minutes." But 2 minutes stretched to 5, then 10. We called his name, receiving no response except our own voices echoing back from the pines. The thing wearing Jennifer's face sat perfectly still, staring into the fire with unblinking eyes. "Robert!" Sarah called again, panic creeping into her voice. "He'll be back," the Jennifer thing said without looking away from the flames. "They always come back." The way it said "they" made my blood freeze. How many campers had disappeared in this clearing? How many had returned? Changed. Sarah grabbed my arm. "We need to find him. Something's very wrong here." I nodded, standing slowly. The Jennifer thing finally looked up at us, and I saw that its eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface. In the firelight, they looked like holes in its face. "Don't leave the fire," it said in Jennifer's voice. "It's not safe in the dark." But staying felt far less safe than leaving. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire to use as a torch, and Sarah and I headed in the direction Robert had gone. Behind us, I could hear the Jennifer thing humming, a low, droning sound that seemed to resonate in my chest. We found Robert about 50 yards from camp, standing perfectly still beside a massive pine tree. His back was to us, and he didn't respond when we called his name. "Robert." Sarah reached out to touch his shoulder. He turned around slowly, and I nearly dropped the torch. His face was Robert's face, but wrong, in the same way the Jennifer thing was wrong. His features were slightly blurred, as if someone had smeared wet paint across them. His eyes were that same solid black. "Hello," he said in Robert's voice, but the word came out in perfect monotone. "I got lost, but I found my way back. We should return to camp," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. The Robert thing nodded with mechanical precision. "Yes, return to camp." We walked back together, but I noticed that neither of the things cast shadows in our torchlight. Sarah noticed it too. I could see her staring at the ground where their shadows should have been, her face growing paler with each step. Back at the fire, the two things sat in their chairs and stared into the flames without speaking. Sarah and I huddled together on the opposite side of the fire pit, whispering frantically. "What are they?" Sarah asked. "I don't know, but they're not Jennifer and Robert anymore." "What do we do?" I looked at our car keys, sitting on the picnic table beside the Jennifer thing. We'd need to get past both creatures to reach the vehicle, and even then, we'd have to navigate those treacherous roads in complete darkness. We wait for morning, I decided. Try to get some sleep in shifts, keep watch. But the things didn't sleep. They sat motionless through the entire night, occasionally turning their heads to stare at us with those black eyes. When dawn finally broke, they stood in unison and announced they were going to gather breakfast materials from the forest. They walked into the tree line together, moving with identical gliding strides. As soon as they were out of sight, Sarah and I ran for the car. The keys weren't where we'd left them. We searched frantically through the campsite, checking pockets, bags, anywhere they might have been misplaced. Nothing. "They took them," Sarah realized. "They're trapping us here." We heard footsteps returning from the forest, 4 sets of them now, though only 2 figures had left. The Jennifer thing and Robert thing emerged from the trees, followed by 2 other figures I didn't recognize. a middle-aged man in hiking gear and a younger woman wearing a college sweatshirt. Both had the same wrong proportions, the same black eyes. "We found friends," the Jennifer thing announced in its flat monotone. They were lost, too. The four creatures arranged themselves around our dead fire pit, staring at us with patient intensity. I realized we were looking at other campers who had found this clearing, other victims who had been replaced by whatever malevolent force inhabited this place. "What do you want?" I demanded, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "To go home," the Jennifer thing replied. "To return to your world, to live your lives." "Why?" "Because we can," the Robert thing said. "Because you brought us out of the dark places. Because you showed us your forms." I understood then. These weren't just random monsters. They were skinwalkers, creatures from indigenous folklore that I'd read about in college anthropology courses. Beings that could steal the appearance of humans, wearing their forms like clothing while the original owners were… what? Dead? Imprisoned? I didn't want to think about it. The real Jennifer and Robert, where are they? The creature wearing Jennifer's face smiled, and the expression was so wrong on those familiar features that Sarah whimpered beside me. "They're safe," it said, "sleeping, dreaming of home while we learn to be them. Let them go." "No." The four creatures stood in unison, and I realized our time for talking was over. Whatever happened next would determine whether Sarah and I joined their collection or found some way to escape. I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran. We crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. Behind us, I could hear pursuit, not running footsteps, but that same measured walking pace. The creatures weren't hurrying because they knew something we didn't. They knew this forest. They knew where every trail led, every dead end, every false hope. We ran anyway, crashing through pine boughs and stumbling over hidden roots. The forest seemed to shift around us, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks rearranging themselves when we weren't looking directly at them. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north in this place where normal rules didn't apply. Sarah stumbled and fell, crying out as she twisted her ankle. I helped her up, but she couldn't put weight on it. "Leave me," she gasped. "Get help." "No." I pulled her arm over my shoulder, supporting her weight. "We stick together." We hobbled forward through the endless pines, and I began to notice something that made my skin crawl. The trees were too uniform, too perfectly spaced. The forest felt artificial, like a stage set designed to look natural from a distance but revealing its false nature up close. Then I heard it, Jennifer's voice, calling from somewhere behind us. "Michael, Sarah, where are you? We're worried." But it wasn't right. The voice carried no emotion, no real concern. It was Jennifer's vocal cords producing the words, but there was no soul behind them. "Please come back," Robert's voice joined in. "We just want to help." Sarah shuddered against me. They sound so much like them. "They're not them," I reminded her, but part of me wondered. What if we were wrong? What if our friends really had just been affected by the isolation, the strange atmosphere of this place? What if we were running from the people trying to help us? The doubt lasted until I heard the Jennifer thing laugh, a sound like breaking glass that no human throat could produce. We pressed on, but the forest seemed endless. Every direction looked identical. Every trail led deeper into the maze of pines. The voices behind us grew closer, though they maintained that same unhurried pace. That's when I realized the truth. They weren't chasing us to catch us. They were herding us somewhere specific. The trees opened suddenly into another clearing, and my heart sank. It was our campsite. We'd walked in a perfect circle, and now the four creatures stood waiting for us beside our cold fire pit. "Welcome back," the Jennifer thing said. "You look tired." Sarah collapsed beside me, exhausted and defeated. I looked around desperately for anything we could use as a weapon, but found only camping gear and dead pine needles. That's when I noticed something that sparked a desperate hope. My jacket, hanging on a camp chair, had something bulging in the pocket. My emergency flare gun. I'd forgotten about it until now. "What happens next?" I asked, trying to keep the creature's attention while slowly moving toward my jacket. "Next, we practice being you," the Robert thing replied. "We study your mannerisms, your speech patterns, your memories. Then we return to your city and live your lives." "What about our real friends? Jennifer and Robert?" "They'll dream forever in the dark places," the Jennifer thing said. "Pleasant dreams of their lives while we live them in reality." I reached my jacket and slipped my hand into the pocket, fingers closing around the flare gun's grip. "And if we don't cooperate?" "You will." The creature wearing the college girl's face spoke for the first time. "Everyone cooperates eventually. Or they join the dreamers." I pulled out the flare gun and aimed it at the Jennifer thing's chest. "Let them go." The four creatures looked at the weapon with mild curiosity, showing no fear. "That cannot harm us," the Jennifer thing said. "We are not made of flesh." "Maybe not," I replied, thumb finding the trigger. "But you're wearing flesh, and I'm betting you can't just abandon a damaged form and find a new one immediately." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the creature's stolen features. "You would destroy your friend's body." "That's not my friend," I said firmly. "My friend is trapped in your dream world. This is just stolen meat." I pulled the trigger. The flare burst from the gun in a streak of brilliant red light, striking the Jennifer thing center mass. The creature's stolen body erupted in flames that burned with an unnatural intensity. It opened its mouth to scream, but instead of sound, black smoke poured out like a waterfall. The other three creatures reacted with inhuman shrieks, their forms beginning to blur and shift. I grabbed Sarah and ran toward the tree line again, but this time I had a destination in mind. The flare gun had given me an idea. We crashed through the underbrush as the creatures' cries echoed behind us, no longer maintaining their pretense of measured pursuit. They moved through the forest like liquid shadow, flowing between trees and over obstacles. I led Sarah to the largest pine tree I could find, one with thick, resinous bark that would burn easily. Pulling out my emergency lighter, I held the flame to the bark until it caught. Pine resin ignited like gasoline, sending flames racing up the trunk. "What are you doing?" Sarah gasped. "Burning down their playhouse," I replied, moving to the next tree. "This whole forest feels wrong because it's not real. It's some kind of pocket dimension they've created to trap people. But if it's not real, it might not be stable." The second tree caught fire even faster than the first. I continued from pine to pine, creating a growing inferno. Behind us, the creature's shrieks grew more desperate and angry. The fire spread with unnatural speed, consuming trees that should have been too green to burn. As the flames grew higher, the forest began to change. The too perfect spacing of the trees became more obvious, and I could see the edges of the illusion, places where the false forest simply stopped, revealing star-filled void beyond. "Look," Sarah pointed back toward our campsite. Through the trees, we could see the clearing where we'd been trapped, but now it wasn't empty. Scattered around the fire pit were dozens of sleeping forms, all the people who had been taken over the years, dreaming their endless dreams while the creatures wore their faces in the outside world. I spotted Jennifer and Robert among them, lying peacefully on the pine needles. They looked pale and thin, but alive. The fire reached the clearing just as the three remaining creatures arrived, their stolen forms beginning to dissolve in the heat and light. The things that had been wearing human faces revealed their true nature, writhing shadows with too many limbs and mouths full of needle teeth, but the fire was consuming their refuge, destroying the pocket of false reality they'd created. As the flames spread, the sleeping forms began to stir. Jennifer's eyes opened first, confusion and terror flickering across her face as she saw the burning forest around her. "Michael," she called out, her voice weak but genuinely hers. The shadowling shrieked one final time as their domain collapsed around them. The false forest dissolved into smoke and starlight, leaving us standing in what I now recognized as a normal clearing in the Delaware State Forest. Our car sat exactly where we'd left it, and my phone showed 3 bars of signal. Jennifer and Robert were weak but unharmed, with no memory of anything after going to sleep on our first night. They believed they'd simply slept until morning, unaware that days had passed in the real world while they dreamed. We never spoke about what really happened in that clearing. How could we explain that our friends had been replaced by skinwalkers feeding on their life force? How could we tell them they'd been trapped in an artificial dream world while shadows wore their faces? Instead, we told them they'd gotten sick from something in the water and we'd decided to cut the trip short. They accepted this explanation, having no memories to contradict it. But sometimes, in quiet moments at the office, I catch Jennifer or Robert staring into space with expressions that don't quite match their personalities. Their movements are occasionally too smooth, their speech patterns subtly different. When I ask if they're feeling all right, they always smile and assure me they're fine. I tell myself it's just my imagination, trauma from that weekend making me see things that aren't there. After all, they have all their memories back. They laugh at the same jokes, enjoy the same foods, maintain their old friendships and habits. But last week, I watched Jennifer eat her lunch and I swear she chewed each bite exactly 17 times before swallowing. Robert blinked precisely once every 12 seconds during our morning meeting, as if following some internal timer. And when I checked my phone yesterday, I found a text message I don't remember sending. Planning another camping trip. Found a great spot in the Pine Barrens. You should come. The message was sent to my old college roommate, a man I haven't spoken to in years. I deleted the text and told myself I must have sent it by accident. But, as I write this, I realize I can't remember sending any texts at all yesterday. And when I look in the mirror, sometimes my reflection seems to lag behind my movements by just a fraction of a second. The skinwalkers burned with their false forest, I keep telling myself. They couldn't have survived. But what if they didn't need to survive? What if, in those final moments before the fire consumed everything, they found new hosts among the rescuers? What if they're still here, still learning to be us, still practicing until they're perfect enough to fool even themselves? I don't know for certain. I can't know for certain. But if you're reading this and you know me, if you work with me, live near me, count me as a friend, pay attention. Watch for the small inconsistencies, the minor details that don't quite add up. Count my blinks, time my movements. Notice if I chew my food differently than I used to. And whatever you do, don't accept any invitations to go camping in the Delaware Pine Barrens. Some things should stay buried in the dark places where they belong.